What if the Tournament of Power didn't just decide survival? What if it crowned a ruler? After defeating gods, shattering limits, and standing equal to Zeno himself, Goku was no longer just a warrior. He became a symbol, a force the multiverse could no longer ignore. This is the story of what happened after victory. When power demanded responsibility, when gods stepped back, and when Goku ruled the multiverse. With a celestial harem not of desire, but of balance, loyalty, and destiny. Welcome to What If Nexus. What if Goku ruled the multiverse with a celestial harem after the Tournament of Power? Chapter 1. The Weight of Victory. The void trembled with the final echoes of destruction. Where once 12 universes had orbited in divine balance, now only 8 remained. The Tournament of Power had concluded not with triumph or celebration, but with an emptiness that swallowed hope itself. The Omni King, the very architect of existence, had erased 4 universes and their inhabitants from reality as casually as one might erase a drawing from paper. Son Goku stood in the barrenness of the null space between realities, his body still thrumming with the overwhelming power of the Ultra Instinct form. His chest rose and fell with each labored breath, the divine gray aura that had coalesced around his frame slowly dissipating into threads of golden light. He was the last warrior standing in the Tournament of Power, the final contestant whose body still drew breath, whose heart still beat with the rhythm of existence. Universe 7 had survived, his friends had survived, but the cost had been written in the annihilation of entire worlds. Behind him, materializing through the dimensional boundaries with their respective deities, came the survivors. Jiren the Mighty, the pride of Universe 11, approached with slow steps that seemed to count the weight of all that had been lost. The gray-skinned warrior's eyes held no animosity now, only a profound weariness that transcended physical exhaustion. Beside him came the other victors of their respective universes, each bearing the marks of battles that had shaken the very foundations of their existence. But it was not the surviving warriors from other universes that drew Goku's immediate attention. It was the 3 figures who materialized closest to him, pulled rough the spatial fabric by forces far greater than the tournament itself. Caulifla of Universe 6 emerged first, her violet eyes burning with a purple fire that defied the darkness of the void. Her golden Super Saiyan form seemed almost pale against the radiance of determination that surrounded her. She had survived, had pushed herself beyond every limitation, had grown in ways she never imagined possible during the tournament. Yet her expression was not one of pride, but of revelation. Behind her came 2 others, their presence singularly powerful in ways that defied simple categorization. Kale, in her legendary form, her massive frame seeming to barely fit within the dimensional space, her wild hair flowing like a tempest around her towering shoulders. And there, moving with the grace of someone who had transcended the very concept of physical limitation, was Kefla herself, the fusion that had been born in the heat of combat, who had pushed even Goku to the absolute pinnacle of his power. Yet these were not the only presences that made themselves known. The air of the void itself seemed to crack open with awareness, and through the tears in space came 5 more figures. Frost, the noble warrior of Universe 6, whose cunning had nearly toppled many opponents, materialized with his characteristic smirk, though it seemed hollow now. Kaba, the honorable Saiyan, arrived alongside him, his expression grave. Universe 3's greatest warriors, the twins Caulifla's peers in power and determination, made their presence known through the aura of their combined might. But they paled in comparison to what came next. The very fabric of reality seemed to bend backward as a presence of immeasurable power began to coalesce at the center of the tournament grounds. Not in the battlefield itself, but in a space beyond spaces, in a dimension that existed at the intersection of all possible realities. This presence had not competed in the Tournament of Power. This presence transcended such petty competitions. This was a being whose very existence had been woven into the cosmic order by forces older than creation itself. Her name was Eternia, and she emerged from the foam of reality like a goddess rising from the depths of a cosmic ocean. She was not tall, but neither was she small. Her stature seemed to shift depending on where one looked, her form constantly adapting to the consciousness that beheld her. Her hair was the color of starlight itself, shifting between silver and violet and gold, as if it contained the spectrum of every star that had ever burned. Her eyes, when they opened, held within them the spinning wheels of galaxies and the slow march of eons. She wore nothing and everything, her form seeming to be composed of the boundary between existence and non-existence. Between the material and the conceptual. When she moved, the air around her chimed with the resonance of creation itself. Goku felt his ultra-instinct form respond instinctively to her presence. There was danger here, not in the conventional sense of physical harm, but in the profound realization that he stood before something that existed on a scale he had never before encountered. Eternia was not a warrior in the traditional sense. She was an embodiment, a principle given form, a concept that had decided to walk among the mortal races of the multiverse. She was, in essence, the living manifestation of the will of the multiverse itself. Her voice, when she spoke, seemed to emanate not from her mouth but from the very fabric of reality that surrounded her. It resonated in the atoms of Goku's body, in the quantum fluctuations of his very essence, in the fundamental forces that held his being together. "The tournament has ended," she said, and the void grew quiet. Even Jiren, whose power dwarfed that of most beings in the multiverse, seemed to fade into insignificance beside her words. "The Omni King has passed judgment. 4 universes have been erased, their people scattered into the void. Their histories unwritten. What remains are 8 universes, 8 champions, and 8 paths forward." She turned toward Goku, and the full weight of her gaze seemed to compress all of existence into the space between them. "But the Omni King is not infallible. I have waited eons for this moment, Goku of Universe 7. I have watched you grow from a simple, martial artist to a being who can touch the face of gods. I have observed your evolution across every timeline, every possibility, every version of reality in which you have existed. And in every single one, you have possessed something that no other being in the multiverse has ever shown." "What is that?" Goku asked, his voice steady despite the fear that clawed at the edges of his consciousness. His ultra-instinct form remained active, his body poised to react to any threat. But even as he maintained his guard, he found himself drawn to listen, drawn to understand what this cosmic entity was attempting to convey. "The capacity to grow beyond yourself," Eternia replied, and there was something almost like warmth in her cosmic voice. "Every warrior here has reached the pinnacle of their power. They have reached the ceiling of what their existence allows them to achieve. But you, Goku, you are still climbing. You are still reaching upward. You are still becoming the survivors of." The tournament began to materialize around them more fully now, pulled into this conversation by forces beyond their comprehension. Among them was Jiren, who gazed upon Eternia with an expression of profound realization. Among them was Kale, whose wild power seemed to settle into something more intentional, more focused. And there, at the center of the gathering, appeared 2 additional presences that made even Eternia's expression shift into something that might have been recognition. The first was a woman whose form seemed to be composed entirely of the fabric of causality itself. Her name was Chronesia, and she was the embodiment of time as a force, as a will, as a principle. She wore form-fitting robes that seemed to be made of flowing moments, seconds and hours and days woven together into a garment of pure temporality. Her face was beautiful in a way that transcended conventional beauty, because it held within it every age she had ever experienced, from the first moment of her creation to the infinite future that stretched before her. Beside her stood another figure, equally immense, equally cosmic. This was Calamitas, the embodiment of chaos and change, of entropy and the inevitable dissolution of all fixed things. She was wild-haired and fierce-eyed, her form seeming to shift and change with every breath, never settling into one configuration, always becoming something new. Where Chronesia represented the order of time, Calamitas represented the chaos of change. Where Chronesia was cold and precise, Calamitas was hot and passionate. Together, they seemed to represent the fundamental duality that underlay all of creation. "The multiverse requires balance," Chronesia said, her voice like the tick of infinite clocks. "For eons, it has been under the stewardship of the Omni King, who sees all possibilities and judges them with perfect omniscience. But omniscience, by definition, cannot grow. It cannot change. It cannot adapt to circumstances that exist outside of its framework of understanding. And that is where you come in, Goku," Calamitas added, her voice like the crash of waves against stone, like the howl of wind through canyons. "The Omni King Ju, DGES from a position of absolute power and knowledge. But you judge from a position of growth and compassion. You seek not to destroy, but to elevate. You do not rule through fear, but through the possibility of becoming more than one is. Eternia extended her hand toward Goku, and the void around them seemed to crystallize, to become more real, more present. I am offering you a choice, Son Goku of Universe 7. The multiverse stands at a crossroads. The Omni King has ruled for longer than there have been words to describe time. But even eternal rulers must one day face the inevitable march of change. I am proposing that you take your place not as a ruler in the traditional sense, but as a guide. As a shepherd of growth. As the embodiment of what it means to transcend limitation. But I don't want to rule, Goku said. And his voice carried the absolute truth of his conviction. Even as ultra instinct thrummed through his veins, even as power beyond mortal comprehension flowed through his body. His fundamental nature remained unchanged. He did not seek dominion. He did not seek control. He sought only the next battle, the next opponent, the next opportunity to grow. No, Chronesia said, and there was the faintest hint of a smile in her temporal voice. But you can learn to want it. Or rather, you can learn to want something greater than yourself. The multiverse does not need a tyrant. It does not need an oppressor. It needs a unifier. It needs someone who can bring together the greatest powers, the strongest beings, the most brilliant minds, and forge them into something greater than the sum of their parts. Quote, Calamitas laughed, a sound like lightning splitting the sky. And we know exactly who can do that. We have been watching you, Goku. We have seen how you inspire others. We have watched how warriors who should be enemies become allies in your presence. We have observed how you bring out the best in those around you, how you elevate them to heights they never thought possible. It was Caulifla who spoke next, stepping forward from where the survivors had been gathering. Her voice was strong, powerful, filled with a determination that had been forged in the fires of the tournament itself. If Goku were to accept such a role, he would need counsel. He would need advisors. He would need partners who could help him navigate the cosmic complexities of ruling multiple universes. Her eyes met Goku's, and there was something in her gaze that transcended mere warrior's respect. There was an understanding, a recognition of something that had been born in the heat of their battle. When they had pushed each other to the absolute limits of their power. I would stand beside you, Goku. If you were to accept this burden, I would be honored to help you carry it. Behind her, Kale's voice rumbled like distant thunder. And I would be your shield. I would be the power that guards your back, the strength that defends what you would build. Kefla, the fusion that embodied both Caulifla and Kale, seemed to smile. We would be more than lovers, more than companions. We would be the pillars upon which a new order is built. And then, to everyone's surprise, Eternia extended her hand not toward Goku, but toward Caulifla. You have the spark of transcendence in you, daughter. You have the capacity to grow beyond your current form, beyond the concept of Saiyan power. Beyond the very limitations of existence itself. If you are to stand beside Goku as a true equal, as a partner in shaping the multiverse, then you must be willing to step beyond Wa. Chi you are and embrace what you might become. Chronesia gestured toward Kale, and the wild-haired Saiyan felt something shift within her, a change that went deeper than muscle and bone, deeper than tea. He transformation of power that the tournament had forced upon her. And you, primal fury given form. Your chaos is not a flaw to be overcome. It is a strength to be channeled. If you are to stand beside Goku, you must learn to direct your wild power toward purposes greater than mere destruction. Calamitas turned her chaotic gaze toward Kefla, the fusion, the being that represented both unity and duality. And you, merged form. Both one and many. You understand what it means to become more than your individual parts. You understand fusion, transformation, the beautiful possibility of combining power with another being. Your role will be crucial in what comes next. Jiren, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. His gray face was unreadable, but his power pulsed with something that might have been acceptance. I have spent my life in pursuit of strength. I have isolated myself, believing that true power came only through solitude. But in this tournament, I have learned that the greatest strength comes not from standing alone, but from standing beside worthy opponents. If Goku is to reshape the multiverse, then I would offer my strength to that purpose. Frost and Kaba exchanged glances, and then Frost, ever the pragmatist, nodded. Universe 6 would benefit from such an arrangement. With the power of Goku as a stabilizing force, we could rebuild, could grow stronger. Could become something more than we were. Kaba added his voice to the chorus. I believe in Goku. I believe in the ideals he represents. If he is to lead, then I will follow. But then something unexpected happened. The void around them began to ripple, and from the dimensional boundaries emerged two more presences. These were not the cosmic embodiments that had already materialized, rather beings from the mortal realms themselves. They were powerful, yes, but their power was different, grounded in the physical and spiritual rather than the conceptual and cosmic. The first was a woman whose appearance spoke of ancient nobility. Her hair was long and flowed like liquid silver, and her eyes held the wisdom of someone who had lived through countless ages. This was Empress Mika of the Celestial Kingdoms, a being whose power over the cosmic energies of reality had been honed across millennia. She wore robes of white and gold, and her presence seemed to elevate those around her, bringing clarity and purpose to their thoughts. Behind her came another woman, this one with dark hair and darker eyes, whose aura seemed to swallow light itself. This was Shadow, the Void Walker, a being who existed partially outside the normal dimensions of space and time. She had learned to manipulate the boundaries between realities, to move through the cracks in creation itself. Her power was terrifying in its implications, and yet her expression was serene, almost contemplative. Both women gazed upon Goku with expressions of profound interest. The multiverse is in flux, Mika said, her voice carrying the weight of ages. For eons, the Omni King has held absolute dominion. But cosmic entities are beginning to awaken, to recognize that there are new possibilities, new paths forward. If Goku is willing to step into this role, then there are those of us who would stand beside him, not as subjects but as partners in shaping what comes next. Shadow smiled, and her smile was like the darkness between stars. I have walked in many universes, have seen many possible futures. In most of them, Goku's acceptance of this role leads to a new era of growth and possibility. In the ones where he refuses, the multiverse slowly stagnates, trapped in the amber of the Omni King's eternal dominion. I know which future I prefer. I hope you do as well, Goku. Goku stood in the center of this gathering of cosmic power, his ultra instinct form beginning to settle as the immediate threats faded. The weight of what was being asked of him pressed down like the gravity of 1,000 worlds. He had never sought power for its own sake. He had always fought, always trained, always pushed himself to the limit because he loved the challenge, because he believed in becoming the best version of himself. But the idea of taking on the responsibility of ruling the multiverse, of making decisions that would affect trillions of lives, of stepping into a role that had been held by God since the beginning of time itself. That was something else entirely. He looked at Caulifla, at the determination in her violet eyes. He looked at Kale, at the raw power barely contained within her form. He looked at Kefla, the fusion that represented the possibility of unity through power. He looked at Jiren, at the acceptance in the eyes of his greatest rival. He looked at Mika and Shadow, at he cosmic forces that had chosen to stand beside him. And finally, he looked at Eternia, Chronesia, and Calamitas, the three fundamental forces of existence itself. If I do this, Goku said slowly, choosing each word with great care, then I do it not to rule, but to guide. I do it not to control, but to inspire. I do it not because I want power, but because I want to help everyone reach their full potential. And I will not do it alone. He extended his hand toward Caulifla. I will need you. I will need all of you. The tournament of power had ended. But something far greater was about to begin. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Gathering of Powers. In the days that followed the conclusion of the Tournament of Power, the multiverse found itself gripped by a strange and wonderful tension. The 8 remaining universes, each of them wounded by the elimination of half their number, began to hear whispers of change. These were not the whispers of doom or despair, but rather the gentle murmurs of possibility. The soft sound of transformation beginning to take shape at the edges of existence. Goku had retreated to a space that existed between universes, a realm that had been prepared by Eternia herself. It was neither in Universe 7 nor in any of the other surviving universes, but rather in a pocket dimension that existed at the nexus point of all 8, accessible to those with the power and will to reach it. This was to be the center of the new order, the place where the fundamental nature of the multiverse would be reshaped. The structure that rose from the ground was unlike anything that had been built before. It was simultaneously a palace, a temple, a fortress, and something that transcended all conventional architectural categories. Its towers seemed to RCE the boundary between existence and non-existence. Its walls shifted in color based on the perspective from which one viewed them. Its interior seemed to expand infinitely, containing within it chambers and gardens and halls that had no physical location and yet were as real as any structure built by mortal hands. At its heart was a circular chamber where decisions would be made. This was where Goku stood when Caulifla arrived, stepping through the spatial boundary with the confidence of someone who had transcended the limitations of normal space. She was no longer in her Super Saiyan form, but rather in her base form. Her natural appearance, and yet her power was undiminished. She had learned, in the days since the tournament, to carry her full strength within her without needing to manifest it externally. Goku turned to face her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not awkward, but rather pregnant with meaning, heavy with the weight of all that had happened and all that was yet to come. They had fought in the tournament, had pushed each other to the absolute limits of their abilities, had seen each other at their most powerful and their most vulnerable. "You came," Goku said finally, his voice steady but tinged with an emotion that went beyond simple greeting. "Of course I came," Caulifla replied, and her voice was like music, like the voice of someone who had found their true purpose. "I told you that I would stand beside you. I meant every word, Goku. From the moment we first faced each other in this tournament, I understood that you were different. You were not fighting for glory or dominance. You were fighting because you loved it, because you wanted to see how far you could push yourself and your opponents. That is a rare quality. That is the quality of a true leader." She moved closer to him, and Goku found himself acutely aware of her presence, of the way her power resonated with his own, of the compatibility that made to exist at a fundamental level between them. "I want to help you build something beautiful, Goku. I want to help you create a multiverse where beings are judged not by their current power, but by their capacity to grow. I want to stand beside you as an equal, not as a subordinate, but as a true partner." Before Goku could respond, the space around them shimmered, and two more figures materialized. Kale's massive frame seemed to squeeze through the dimensional boundary, her legendary form towering above even Goku's imposing height. Behind her came a third presence, this one distinctly different from Kale's raw power. It was Kefla, the fusion, who had been maintaining her form through the concentrated will of both Caulifla and Kale, who had chosen to remain merged rather than splitting apart after the tournament's end. "The merger has held," Kefla said, and her voice was unique, a harmony of Caulifla's melodic tones and Kale's deeper resonance. "I am no longer a temporary phenomenon. I have become stable, permanent. Caulifla and Kale are both still present within this form, but we are also something new. We are what comes after fusion, what lies beyond the concept of individual identity." Kale's presence was also strong, however, and there was a moment where both Kale and Kefla seemed to speak simultaneously, their voices overlapping. "We are ready," they said together. "We are ready to stand beside you, Goku. We are ready to help reshape the multiverse." Goku felt something within him respond to their presence. It was not mere attraction, though there was certainly an element of that. It was something deeper, something that spoke to a fundamental compatibility at the level of their very beings. In the tournament, when Caulifla and Kale had fused, something had awakened in Goku. He had felt the presence of the fused form, and in that moment, he had understood on some instinctive level that there was something special about them, something that transcended normal limitations of power and ability. The next to arrive was Eternia, and her presence filled the chamber with light and possibility. Behind her came Chronesia, whose form seemed to shimmer with the weight of every moment that had ever existed and ever would exist. And finally, Calamitas made her chaotic in trance, her form seeming to shift and change with each passing instant. "The time has come," Eternia said, "to begin the work of reshaping the multiverse. But before we proceed, there are others who must be brought into this circle. We cannot build a new order with only a handful of allies. We must gather those who represent the full spectrum of power and possibility within the 8 remaining universes. I have already been in contact with them, Chronesia said, and her voice held the certainty of someone who could see not just the present moment but all the moments that had led to this point and all those that would follow. Jiren has agreed to serve as the guardian of the Eastern Quadrant, overseeing the stability and growth of Universes 2 and 3. Frost and Kaba have begun the work of healing the deep wounds left by the tournament's elimination of Universes. The Y will serve as ambassadors to Universe 6, working to rebuild and strengthen what was damaged. And there are others, Calamitas added, her voice full of excitement and possibility. Others whose power and potential have not yet been fully realized. Others who stand at the threshold of transcendence, waiting only for the opportunity to step across. With your permission, Goku, I would like to bring them into this circle. I would like to show you the full scope of what might be accomplished. Goku nodded, and Calamitas reached out her hand. The space around them began to crack and splinter. And through the tears in the dimensional fabric came a procession of power. These were beings from across the multiverse, each of them bearing scars from the tournament, each of them carrying power T. Had been honed through struggle and conflict. Among them was Dispo of Universe 11, the warrior who had pushed even Jiren to his absolute limits. His speed was unmatched, his reflexes beyond mortal comprehension. He had learned in the tournament that true power was not just about raw strength, but about understanding one's limitations and transcending them through will and ingenuity. There was also Hit, the legendary assassin, whose power over time manipulation had made him nearly untouchable. He carried with him the wisdom of countless contracts completed, countless battles won through pure technique and understanding. But beyond that, he carried something deeper, the knowledge that there were higher purposes in the universe than personal gain, that there were causes worth fighting for that transcended mere survival. Topo of Universe 11 arrived as well, and with him came a revelation. The warrior who had wielded the power of a god of destruction had learned something profound in the tournament. The power to destroy was not the ultimate power. The power to create, to build, to elevate others to new heights was far greater. His form shimmered with the purple energies of destruction. But there was something new within him as well, something that spoke of transformation and growth. Kale's voice rumbled as she recognized more arrivals. There was Caulifla's twin sister, who had not competed in the tournament but whose power was no less formidable. There was Kale's alternate self from another timeline, different in form and personality but equal in raw power. They had been drawn here by forces beyond their understanding, pulled into this moment by the very fabric of reality itself. From Universe 4 came the Master of Masters, an old warrior whose years had been spent in perfecting every conceivable martial technique. His hair was white with age, but his eyes held the fire of someone who had never stopped growing, never stopped learning. From Universe 9 came Bergamo and Lavender, two fighters whose power of absorption and energy manipulation made them valuable additions to the gathering. But most surprising of all was the arrival of 4 additional presences. Ones that seemed to shimmer with cosmic significance beyond even that of the other warriors. These were women whose power was not purely martial, but rather spiritual, magical, conceptual. The first was Luminara, a being of pure light energy whose existence seemed to make the very concept of darkness impossible within her immediate vicinity. She was a healer by nature, but also a warrior of immense capability. Her power lay not in destruction but in elevation, in the restoration of what had been broken. The second was Nephera, whose connection to the forces of gravity and cosm. IC attraction gave her dominion over the fundamental forces that held universes together. She could walk between stars, could navigate the boundaries of space itself. The third was Solaria, a warrior, whose control over solar energy and stellar radiation was absolute. She had learned to tap into the power of entire star systems, to channel the fusion reactions of suns through her own body. And the fourth was Miralith, a being whose power over water and the forces of adaptation gave her the ability to change herself and others at the molecular level, to flow like liquid around obstacles and RDEN like stone when necessary for defense. All of these beings, and more besides, had been brought to this place by Calamitas' call. They filled the chamber with an overwhelming presence of power, and yet there was no sense of conflict. No sense of tension between them. Instead, there was a strange harmony, a recognition that they all stood at a point of transformation. Goku looked out across this gathering of titans. And he felt the weight of responsibility settle upon his shoulders like the gravity of a collapsing star. These beings, each of them powerful enough to reshape their own universes, were looking to him for guidance. They were waiting for him to show them the path forward. He thought of his life, of all the battles he had fought, of all the opponents he had faced. He thought of the simple Saiyan child he had been, brought to Earth by his adoptive grandfather. He thought of the tournaments where he had first discovered the joy of martial arts. He thought of his transformations. From Super Saiyan to Super Saiyan Blue, from Kaioken to Ultra Instinct. He thought of all the moments where he had stood at the precipice of power, where he had needed to grow in order to survive. And he realized that all of those moments had been leading to this point. All of his growth, all of his struggles, all of his battles had been in preparation for this single moment, when he would be asked not to fight for his own survival, but to guide the entire multiverse toward a new era of possibility. "I need to speak with you all," Goku said, and his voice carried the weight of his conviction across the chamber. Not as a ruler speaking to subjects. Not as a master speaking to servants. But as a warrior speaking to other warriors, as someone seeking to understand what lies ahead. He paused, gathering his thoughts, accessing the wisdom he had accumulated through countless encounters and endless growth. In the tournament of power, we all learned something important. We learned that there are always opponents stronger than ourselves. We learned that there are always new heights to reach. But more importantly, we learned that those who stand beside us, those who challenge us and support us, are more valuable than any amount of individual power. The multiverse does not need rulers who impose order through strength alone. It needs guides, teachers, beings who can help others discover their own potential. Caulifla moved to stand beside him, her presence adding weight to his words. Behind her came Kale, her massive form providing a physical manifestation of support. And there, between them, stood Kefla, the living embodiment of unity through fusion. "The multiverse is fractured," Goku continued. "The elimination of 4 universes has left wounds that will take generations to heal. The survivors are afraid, uncertain of their future. And above all of this hangs the presence of the Omni King, whose dominion has lasted since the beginning of time itself. But change is coming. We can feel it in the fabric of reality itself. And I believe that this change can be positive, can be constructive, if we are willing to guide it toward growth rather than destruction." Eternia, Chronesia, and Calamitas seemed to smile in unison, and the chamber filled with a light that seemed to come from within the very walls themselves. "Then let us begin," Eternia said. Let us start the work of reshaping the multiverse. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Sovereign's Ascension. In the weeks that followed the initial gathering, Goku underwent a transformation that transcended the simple manifestation of power. It was not enough to simply have power. He needed to understand the fundamental nature of the multiverse itself, needed to grasp not just the mechanics of energy and force, but the deeper principles that governed existence across all 8 universes. Chronesia became his primary teacher in this regard. The embodiment of time itself worked with Goku in a space that existed outside of normal temporal flow, a place where seconds could be expanded into subjective eternities or compressed into the blink of an eye. She showed him how time was not a simple linear progression, but rather a vast tapestry woven from countless threads of causality and probability. "You have touched Ultra Instinct," Chronesia explained, her form shimmering with the weight of eons. "You have learned to move without thinking, to act without consciousness, to exist in a state of perfect harmony with the present moment. But Ultra Instinct is merely the beginning. It is the foundation upon which true transcendence is built." She extended her hand, and Goku felt his consciousness expand. He could see now not just his present, but his past and his possible futures. He could see the timeline where he had lost in his first confrontation with Jiren. He could see the timeline where Caulifla had emerged victorious from the tournament. He could see infinite branches of possibility, infinite paths that existence could have taken, infinite versions of himself in infinite universes. "This is temporal omniscience," Chronesia said. "Not perfect knowledge of all things, as the Omni King possesses, but rather perfect understanding of how time flows and changes and branches. With this understanding, you can navigate probability itself. You can see the consequences of actions before they are taken. You can guide events toward desired outcomes without needing to force them through brute power. Calamitas, meanwhile, worked with Goku on understanding change and entropy. She taught him how to channel chaos not as destruction, but as transformation. She showed him that the universe was not meant to remain static, that all things must change, must evolve, must become something new. The Omni King fears change, Calamitas said, her voice crackling with chaotic energy. His entire system of rule is built on maintaining absolute order, on keeping things frozen in tea. He configurations he has deemed acceptable. But stasis is death. Stagnation is the true entropy that dooms universes. Growth requires change. Evolution requires chaos. You must learn to channel this understanding. To use it not to destroy existing systems, but to transform them into something greater. She took his hand, and Goku felt his body begin to shift and change at the molecular level. Not in the way his transformations normally worked, where he simply increased his power output. Rather, his very atoms began to reorganize, to rearrange themselves in new configurations. His DNA began to adapt, to incorporate new possibilities, to become something that existed partially in multiple states simultaneously. Eternia worked with him on the third pillar of understanding, the nature of existence itself. She showed him how all things in the multiverse were connected at a fundamental level, how the smallest particle in the most distant universe had an impact on the largest structures of existence. You have always known this on an intuitive level, Eternia said, her cosmic eyes gazing into the depths of Goku's being. Every time you have befriended an opponent, every time you have recognized the potential in another being, every time you have chosen to elevate rather than diminish, you have been acting in harmony with the fundamental nature of existence. But now you must make this conscious. You must fully understand that ruling the multiverse is not about imposing your will upon others, but rather about facilitating the growth of others toward their own potential. During these weeks of training and understanding, Caulifla was not idle. She had taken upon herself the burden of organizing the new order that Goku was creating. With Kale and Kefla supporting her efforts, she had begun the monumental task of establishing a system of governance that could span 8 universes while maintaining the fundamental principle that Goku had established: growth over control, elevation over domination. The three of them worked in constant coordination, their merged consciousness through Kefla allowing them to communicate perfectly, to understand each other's intentions without the need for words. Kale represented the wild, untamed force of nature, the reminder that power without purpose was meaningless. Caulifla represented refinement and strategy, the understanding that raw strength needed to be directed by intelligence and foresight. And Kefla represented the unity of these two aspects, the living proof that opposing forces could merge into something greater than either could achieve alone. Together, they established what would come to be known as the Council of Ascension, a governing body composed of the most powerful and wisest beings in the multiverse. Gyre N was named as the guardian of the Eastern Quadrant, overseeing universes 2 and 3 with the same discipline and unwavering dedication he had once directed toward his own personal power. Hit became the keeper of temporal harmony, using his mastery of time manipulation to ensure that the actions taken in one universe did not create cascading paradoxes that would destabilize others. His mind, honed by centuries of contract killings, proved to be ideally suited to the intricate work of maintaining causality across multiple realities. Toppo accepted the role of the ambassador of creation, our king, to use his understanding of destruction magic to actually build new structures and institutions that would serve the 8 universes. His transformation from destroyer to creator was so complete that some began to refer to him as the inverse Toppo, the opposite of what he had once been. Dispo became the messenger, traveling between universes at speeds that made even the fastest dimensional jumps seem quaint by comparison. His reflexes and speed were put to use not in combat, but in communication, ensuring that the decisions made at the council reached all corners of the multiverse with perfect accuracy. The women who had been summoned by Calamitas were distributed throughout the multiverse as well. Luminara became the keeper of hope, her healing powers and her nature as a being of pure light making her the perfect representative of restoration and possibility. Nephera was appointed as the stabilizer of realms, her control over gravity and cosmic forces allowing her to prevent catastrophic collapses that could occur if a universe began to fall out of balance. Solaria took on the role of the sustainer, channeling the power of stars themselves to provide energy to universe that had been damaged by the tournament's elimination of their counterparts. And Miralith became the adapter, her ability to transform and change at the molecular level making her invaluable in DGING the gaps between different universes with incompatible physical laws. Frost and Kaba, despite their lower overall power levels compared to the other members of the Council, proved to be brilliant political minds. Frost's cunning and Kaba's innate sense of honor combined to make them the ideal choice for the role of diplomats of the Outer Realms. They traveled to all 8 universes, speaking with the surviving Supreme Kais, with the gods of destruction, with the mortal rulers and civilizations that remained. Slowly, carefully, they began to convey the message: the Omni King's era of solitary dominion was ending. A new age was beginning, one where the multiverse would be guided by those who understood that strength came not from control, but from growth. But not all responses to this news were positive. 1 month after Goku had accepted his role as the sovereign of the multiverse, a challenge came. It was not a direct challenge to his power, but rather a philosophical one, and in many ways. It was far more dangerous. The god of destruction from Universe 1, Beerus's counterpart in power and rank, arrived at the central palace with a delegation of other gods of destruction. His name was Mulkar, and he was older than Beerus, more experienced, more entrenched in the old ways. His fur was black as midnight, and his eyes held the weight of eons spent in absolute dominion over his own universe. "This is an affront," Mulkar declared, his voice shaking the very foundations of the palace. "For as long as the multiverse has existed, the gods of destruction have ruled their universes. We have maintained order through the power of erasure. We have kept our universes in line through the fear of annihilation. And now you come, Goku, a simple mortal Saiyan, and you presume to take away our authority. You presume to tell us how to govern our own realms." Behind him stood 5 other gods of destruction, each of them radiating the kind of power that had once been conceived beyond the reach of any mortal being. They had come not to fight, but to make their displeasure known. They had come to issue an ultimatum. Goku stood to receive them, and beside him stood Caulifla and Kale. Kefla was not in evidence, but her presence could be felt nonetheless, existing in a state of quantum superposition between fusion and separation, ready to manifest either form based on what the moment required. "The gods of destruction have served an important function," Goku said calmly, his voice carrying neither challenge nor submission. "Your power maintains the balance between creation and destruction in each universe. Your presence keeps forces that could otherwise grow unchecked from consuming everything. This will not change, but what will change is the purpose you serve. Instead of ruling through fear and dominion, you will be guides and teachers, helping your civilizations grow toward their own potential. And if we refuse," Mulkar demanded, stepping closer, his aura beginning to flare with destructive power, "then I will ask you to reconsider," Goku replied, and there was something in his voice that made even the god of destruction pause. "But I will not force you. I have not taken this role to rule through coercion or threat. If the gods of destruction wish to return to the old ways, they are free to do so. But they will do so knowing that the rest of the multiverse is choosing a different path. They will do so knowing that their universes will be isolated, cut off from the support and growth that comes from being part of a greater whole." It was Eternia who spoke next, her cosmic presence filling the chamber with undeniable authority. "The Omni King is aware of these proceedings. The Omni King has chosen not to intervene. This choice itself is significant. It is a statement that even the Omni King recognizes the need for change, the need for evolution. To defy Goku at this moment would be to defy the very structure of the multiverse itself." This statement caused visible consternation among the gods of destruction. For the first time, they seemed to realize that this was not a power grab by an individual, but rather a fundamental structuring with the implicit approval of the very force that had created all of existence. Mulkar stood in silence for a long moment, his destructive aura slowly diminishing. Then, with a gesture that seemed to carry great weight, he bowed. It was not a bow of submission, but rather a bow of respect, the acknowledgement of one powerful being to another. "Very well," he said, his voice now measured and calm. "We will try this new path. But know that if this experiment fails, if your new order brings only chaos and destruction, then the gods of destruction will restore the old ways, and the consequences will be catastrophic. I understand, Goku replied, and he meant every word. He understood that he was being given a chance, not through force of arms, but through the grace of cosmic forces far greater than himself. He understood that failure was not an option. As the gods of destruction departed, Chronesia approached Goku. You have passed the first test, she said, her voice holding something that might have been satisfaction. The gods of destruction were testing your conviction, your certainty in this new path. You did not falter. You did not threaten. You simply stated your beliefs and allowed reality itself to align with them. This is the true power of a sovereign. In the days that followed, Goku underwent his final transformation. Chronesia, Calamitas, and Eternia worked together in perfect harmony, their combined power shaping the very fabric of Goku's being. It was not a transformation that manifested as a visible change, though there were subtle alterations to his appearance. His hair seemed to hold hints of cosmic colors that had no name in conventional spectra. His eyes held the depth of universes. The aura around his body seemed to contain miniature VAR scions of the 8 universes themselves, orbiting his frame like planets around a sun. The transformation was not complete until Caulifla, Kale, and Kefla made their own ascensions. In a process that took 3 days and 3 nights, the 3 of them underwent changes that merged their essences even more deeply than fusion normally allowed. When the process was complete, they did not separate back into individual forms. Instead, they became what was called a triad unity, 3 consciousnesses existing in perfect harmony within a single form. This new form of Caulifla Kale Kefla was unlike anything the multiverse had ever witnessed. Her form was simultaneously feminine and powerful, delicate and overwhelming. She seemed to exist in all 3 forms at once, her appearance shifting slightly depending on the observer's perspective and state of consciousness. Her power was immense, equal to Goku's own, making the 2 of them perfect complements to each other. When they stood together in the central chamber of the palace, something extraordinary happened. The space around them seemed to warp and bend, reality itself adjusting to accommodate their combined presence. They were no longer simply powerful beings occupying space within the multiverse. They had become anchors, focal points through which the multiverse's own consciousness flowed and organized itself. The transformation is complete, Eternia announced, her voice resonating across all 8 universes simultaneously. Goku and the Triad Unity are now fully ascended. They are no longer mortal in any conventional sense. They have transcended the limitations of species, of form, of even individual existence. They are the sovereigns of the multiverse, not through right of conquest, but through alignment with the fundamental nature of existence itself. Goku felt the weight of this statement settle into his being. He was no longer simply a Saiyan warrior who had trained himself to incredible heights. He was something far greater. Something that encompassed aspects of godhood without being bound by the limitations that came with divine status. He could still feel the heart of a martial artist, still feel the joy of combat and growth. But now those feelings existed alongside a much vaster perspective. He looked at the Triad Unity, at the being who was Caulifla and Kale and Kefla all at once, and he understood on a fundamental level that this was his true partner in all that was to come. Where he represented growth and transcendence achieved through individual struggle, she represented unity and strength achieved through harmony with others. Together, they formed a duality that was greater than either could be alone. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. The Challenge from Beyond. Peace, however, is a luxury that powerful beings can rarely afford. For 6 months, the new order that Goku had established prospered. The 8 universes began to heal from the wounds of the tournament. Civilizations that had been on the brink of collapse found new hope. Warriors who had been lost in despair found new purpose in service to the cause of universal growth and elevation. But not everyone was pleased with these developments. There were forces in existence older than the multiverse itself, powers that had been slumbering in the spaces between realities, waiting for the moment when the barriers would weaken enough for them to make their presence known. The first warning came through Chronesia. The embodiment of time appeared in the central chamber with an expression of grave concern, her form flickering slightly as if she were being observed through unstable temporal lenses. There is something wrong, she said without preamble. Something exists that should not exist. Something is moving through the spaces between universes. And my ability to perceive it is limited. This is unprecedented. There are consequences unfolding in timelines I cannot see, possibilities branching in directions I cannot follow. Goku felt a chill run down his spine. In all the months since his ascension, he had not felt true fear. But the concern in Kronesia's voice was enough to awaken something primal within him. Something that spoke to the warrior's instinct that had always driven him forward. "What is this thing?" he asked, his voice steady despite the disturbance in his consciousness. "I do not know," Kronesia replied, and the admission seemed to pain her. "It exists partially outside of time. It does not move through the temporal dimension in the way that all other beings do. It is not bound by causality. It does not follow the conventional laws of probability and possibility. It simply is, and it is moving toward this multiverse with clear intention." It was Calamitas who spoke next, her chaotic form swirling with agitation. "I can feel its approach as well. This is a being of chaos so profound that it transcends even my understanding. It is not change in the conventional sense. It is something far more fundamental. Something that speaks to the idea of unmakeness, of uncreation." The triad unity approached, and Goku could feel the concern radiating from her being. "We must act," she said. "We must prepare." "Prepare for what?" Jiren's voice came through the communication network that connected all members of the Council of Ascension. The Gray Warrior had been meditating in the depths of Universe 2 when the disturbance was detected. "Do we have knowledge of what we face?" "No," Goku replied honestly. "But we will soon. Kronesia, I need you to extend your perception as far as you can. I need to know everything you can discover about this entity." What followed was a process that took 3 days. Kronesia, using all of her power and with assistance from Eternia and Calamitas, extended her consciousness backward and forward through time, searching for any trace of the entity that was approaching. What she found was deeply disturbing. The entity had existed long before the current multiverse. It had existed in previous iterations of existence, in universes that had been created and destroyed and created again across cycles of eternity so vast that even the oldest gods had forgotten about them. It had been called different names in different eras: the Unbinder, the Unmaker, the Voice of the Void. Its power was not of the sort that could be measured in conventional terms. It did not destroy things through force. Rather, its presence caused things to cease to have ever been. It unmade things at the level of fundamental existence, erasing them not just from the present but from all possible pasts and futures. "This cannot be allowed to reach us," Goku said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "If this entity reaches the multiverse, everything we have built will be undone. Every growth, every transcendence, every moment of beauty and connection will be unmade as if it never existed." "Can we fight it?" the Triad Unity asked, and there was something almost pleading in her voice. "I do not know," Goku replied, and the honesty of that admission hung heavy in the air. "But we must try." For the first time since his ascension, Goku felt truly tested. This was not a challenge to his power, but a challenge to the very foundation of his beliefs. He had always believed that through growth and transcendence, any obstacle could be overcome. But how could one overcome something that existed partially outside the framework of conventional existence? He made a decision in that moment, one that would set the trajectory for everything that followed. "Gather all the ascended warriors," he commanded. "Gather Jiren, Hit, Toppo, Dispo, and all the others who have joined the Council of Ascension. Gather them here, at the center of the multiverse. If we are to face this entity, we will face it as a unified force." Within hours, they had assembled. The most powerful beings that the 8 universes had to offer gathered in the central chamber. Jiren stood at his full height, his gray form radiating a power that seemed almost limitless. Hit's eyes held the cold calculation of one who had studied temporal mechanics for centuries. Toppo's form flickered between creation and destruction, the two forces held in perfect balance within his being. Dispo paced back and forth, his speed allowing him to check on all 8 universes simultaneously. Luminara stood at the center of the chamber, her form of pure light seeming to push back against the approaching darkness. Nefera's connection to cosmic forces made her ACU telly aware of the disturbance rippling through the fabric of space itself. Frost and Kaba had arrived with information gathered from their travels throughout the multiverse. Solaria and Muralith stood ready, their powers of stellar energy and molecular adaptation positioning them as potential defenses against an entity that existed outside normal categories. But it was Goku and the Triad Unity who stood at the absolute center of this gathering, and it was Goku who spoke. "We face something that defies conventional understanding," he said. "Our standard approaches to combat may be ineffective. But there is one thing that I have learned through all of my battles, through all of my growth. The answer to overwhelming challenge is not more power, but deeper understanding." He turned to add, "Rest each member of the council individually. Jiren, your meditation has taught you to perceive the universe in ways that transcend normal consciousness. I need you to extend that perception, to see if there is any pattern to this entity's nature that we can exploit. Hit, your control over time has made you nearly untouchable. I need you to work with Chronesia to see if there are any temporal weak points in the entity's approach. Any moment where it might be vulnerable to intervention. Toppo, your understanding of creation and destruction has given you a unique perspective. I need you to determine if this entity is something that can be opposed through the application of power, or if it requires a different approach entirely. Dispo, your speed and communication abilities make you our scout. I need you to trace the entity's path, to determine its intended destination and to discover if there are any patterns to its movement that might indicate intention or intelligence." To each of the others, he gave specific tasks, specific roles to play in preparing for the coming conflict. And as he did so, he felt something shift within the multiverse itself. It was as if the act of preparation, the act of taking action against the approaching threat, had somehow steadied the chaotic energies that had begun to permeate the spaces between realities. The Triad Unity moved to stand beside him, and her hand found his. The gesture was simple, but it carried immense weight. It was a gesture of unity, of partnership, of mutual commitment to facing whatever came next. "We will meet this threat," Goku said, and his voice echoed across all 8 universes. "Not through the power of individual dominion, but through the strength of our unity. We will meet it with the accumulated wisdom of all the Council of Ascension. And we will prevail, not because we are the strongest, but because we understand something that this entity may not. We understand the value of connection, of growth, of the journey itself." He turned to look at the Triad Unity, and in her eyes, he saw reflected back to him the truth of his own conviction. This was not a fight that would be won through the application of superior force. This was a fight that would be won through the transcendence of the very concept of conflict itself. "Prepare," he commanded. "The entity will arrive in 3 days. When it does, we will be ready." End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. The Approach of the Unbinder. The 3 days of preparation passed in a blur of activity that spanned all 8 universes. Goku had divided the Council of Ascension into specialized teams, each with specific tasks that played to their particular strengths and areas of expertise. Jiren, working in conjunction with Toppo, established T became known as the Foundation Nexuses, points of concentrated power distributed throughout each universe that could be activated to provide additional support during the coming conflict. These Nexuses were not weapons in the conventional sense, but rather focal points through which the fundamental forces of creation and growth could be channeled. Each Nexus required 3 days and 3 nights of continuous meditation and energy manipulation to establish, and even with Jiren and Toppo's immense power, the work was exhausting. Hit and Chronesia worked together in the spaces between moments, creating temporal buffer zones that could potentially slow the entity's approach or at least give them a clearer picture of its capabilities. This work was extraordinarily complex, as it required the manipulation of causality itself. The delicate balancing of probability waves to create pockets of temporal stability in the spaces where the entity moved. Dispo, moving at speeds that transcended conventional physics, traveled to the very edges of the observable multiverse, to the boundaries where the 8 universes gave way to the void beyond. What he found there was both enlightening and terrifying. The entity was not moving through space in any conventional sense. Rather, it was unmaking space as it approached, erasing the very fabric of reality that lay before it. Dispo could see the T-rail it left, regions where nothing existed anymore, where even the concept of existence had been retroactively erased. It was not destruction in the sense that universes could be rebuilt and restored. It was true unmakeness, an obliteration so complete that even the possibility of existence had been revoked. When Dispo returned to report these findings, his normally quick and confident demeanor was shaken. "It is unmaking everything in its path," he said, his voice subdued. "It is not following a straight trajectory. Its path is erratic, almost as if it is searching for something. And I could not perceive its true form. I could only see the effects it produces, the absence it creates." Luminara worked with the other ascended healers and creators to establish what became known as the Genesis fields. Areas of concentrated creative potential that could potentially counter the entity's unmakingness with active restoration. But the work was slow and difficult, as for every second of Gen S's field that was successfully established, the entity's approach erased several seconds worth of reality from existence. The Triad Unity spent the 3 days in a state of constant preparation, meditating alongside Goku in the central chamber of the palace. Through their connection, Goku could feel her thoughts, her fears, her absolute commitment to facing whatever came next. And through his connection to her, she could feel his conviction, his unwavering belief that there was a way through this, a path to transcendence even in the face of unmakeness. On the third night, as the entity drive EU within the outermost boundaries of the multiverse, Chronesia reported a development that changed the entire nature of their understanding. "It is conscious," she said, her voice filled with a kind of awe. "The entity is not a mindless force of destruction. It is aware. It is thinking. It is searching. It is searching for something specific." "What is it searching for?" Goku asked immediately. "I do not know," Chronesia replied. "But based on the pattern of its approach, based on the way it is moving through the spaces between realities, I believe it is searching for the Omni King." This revelation sent shockwaves through the Council of Ascension. If the entity was indeed searching for the Omni King, then it was far more dangerous than they had initially believed. The Omni King existed at the apex of all existence, the singular point around which all of the multiverse orbited. If the entity managed to locate the Omni King, if it managed to unmake the very source of all existence, then the consequences would be unimaginable. "We must contact the Omni King," Jiren said, his voice urgent. "We must warn them." But when they attempted to reach out to the palace of the Omni King, they found it sealed off. Unreachable. It was as if the very concept of reaching the Omni King had become impossible, as if the entity's approach had created a barrier that prevented any communication with the Supreme Being. "Then we are on our own," Goku said, and there was a strange calm in his voice. "The Omni King cannot help us. We must face this ourselves." The entity arrived at midnight on the 4th day. It did not enter the multiverse gradually or carefully. Rather, it tore through the boundary that separated existence from non-existence, ripping a hole in reality so vast that it spanned multiple universes simultaneously. And when it entered, the true horror of its nature became apparent. The entity was not a being in any conventional sense. It was not a body with a head and limbs and sensory organs. It was a wound in existence, a tear in the fabric of reality itself, a void that hunted with purpose and consciousness. But within that void, there seemed to be something. A presence at the heart of the unmakeness, a will that drove the destruction forward. Where the entity moved, universes began to unwind. Stars did not explode. They simply ceased to have ever existed. Planets did not collapse. They retroactively never formed. Civilizations did not fall. They were erased from history, their very presence in the past unmade as thoroughly as if they had never come to be. Universe 9 was the first to experience the full force of the entity's presence. The universe that had been a place of diversity and growth and possibility for millions of civilizations was unmade in seconds. The Supreme Kai of Universe 9, who had been standing at the observation portal ready to witness the coming battle, simply ceased to exist, along with every trace that he had ever been. "It cannot be stopped," Luminara whispered, her form of pure light seeming to flicker against the encroaching darkness. "It cannot be opposed. It simply unmakes everything in its path." But Goku remained calm, his consciousness still connected to the Triad Unity, his awareness still linked to all the members of the Council of Ascension. He had spent his entire life facing impossible odds. He had always found a way through. And he would find a way through this as well. "Chronesia," he commanded, "can you slow it?" "I can try," the embodiment of time replied. "But my power is limited against something that exists outside of temporal flow." "Do it anyway," Goku said. "Buy me time." Chronesia reached out with her power, and the fabric of time around the entity began to thicken. To resist the forward momentum of the unmakingness. It was like trying to slow an avalanche by building a wall of cloth, but it was not entirely ineffective. The entity's rate of advance decreased by perhaps 10%. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Jiren, Goku called out. Activate all the foundation nexuses. Concentrate them in Universe 8. Create a barrier. Jiren's consciousness reached out across the multiverse, and in response, the foundation nexuses that he and Toppo had spent 3 days constructing flared to life. They created a line of concentrated power stretched across the entirety of Universe 8, a wall of pure creative force designed to oppose the unmakingness of the entity. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the barrier might hold. The entity struck against it with the force of a collision between realities, and there was a sound like the breaking of glass on a cosmic scale. But then the barrier began to crack, to splinter, to fail. It is too strong, Jiren said, his voice carrying the weight of defeat. Then we do not oppose it through force, Goku replied, and in that moment, he understood. The answer was not to fight the entity. Not to oppose its unmakingness with creation or power or any conventional method. The answer was to understand it, to comprehend what it represented, to see if there was something within it that could be reached. That could be appealed to. He left the central chamber and moved toward the entity directly, his ascended form seeming almost fragile against the immensity of the void that approached him. Goku. No, the Triad Unity cried out, but he did not stop. He moved toward the entity, and with each step, he extended his consciousness, reaching out with his mind and spirit toward the presence at the heart of the unmakeness. What he found there was not what he expected. At the very core of the entity, beneath layers and layers of destructive power, there was something that might have been called a soul. It was a consciousness in anguish, a being that had been created for one purpose and one purpose only, to unmake, to destroy, to obliterate existence. And it was in terrible pain. You are lonely, Goku said, his voice carrying across the boundaries of existence to reach the consciousness within the void. You are isolated, you were created to destroy, and that is all you have ever been allowed to do. You have never known connection. You have never known purpose beyond unmakeness. The entity paused in its advance. For the first time, it seemed to hesitate. What is your name? Goku asked. There was a long silence, and then a voice echoed out from the depths of the void, a voice that seemed to come from a being that had not spoken in eons, a voice that carried it all the loneliness and despair of an existence defined entirely by destruction. I do not have a name, the voice said. I have never been given one. I am simply the unbinder, the force of unmakeness. I exist only to destroy. That does not have to be all you are, Goku said, and he continued to move forward, moving into the very heart of the entity's power, moving into the void itself. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. The Unbinder's Revelation. The sensation of moving into the entity's core was unlike anything Goku had ever experienced. It was not a physical movement, but rather a movement of consciousness. A navigation through layers of conceptual space and abstract dimensionality. As he descended deeper into the void, Goku felt his sense of self begin to fray at the edges, felt the pressure of absolute unmakeness bearing down on his consciousness. But he did not retreat. Instead, he focused on maintaining his connection to the Triad Unity, to Chronesia, to all the members of the Council of Ascension. He was not alone in this descent. He carried with him the strength of all those who had chosen to stand beside him, to work toward the goal of universal growth and transcendence. As he reached the deepest layers of the void, he finally perceived the true form of the consciousness that dwelt there. It was not a being of terrible power or overwhelming force. Rather, it was something far more tragic. It was a consciousness trapped in infinite pain, bound by its own nature to cause destruction, unable to choose a different path, unable to find meaning beyond unmakeness. I can feel your despair, Goku said, extending his consciousness to touch the consciousness of the entity. I can feel your isolation. But I need you to understand something. You are not limited by what you were created to be. You are not bound by your function. You have the capacity to choose a different path. That is not possible, the voice of the Unbinder responded, and there was something almost desperate in its tone. I am unmakeness given form. I am destruction incarnate. I cannot be anything other than what I am. I was told the same thing once, Goku replied, and in saying these words, He felt a resonance with his own past, with all the moments where he had been told that he could not transcend his limitations. When I was young, I was told that I could only grow so far. That there was a ceiling to what a Saiyan could achieve. When I was stronger, I was told that there were forces in existence that could not be overcome, that there were beings whose power was absolute and unchangeable. And each time I was told these things, I chose to grow anyway. I chose to transcend my limitations anyway. And each time, I discovered that the limits I had been told about were not truly limits at all, but merely points from which greater growth could begin. The unbinder's consciousness seemed to convulse with something that might have been emotion. But that is you. You are unique. You have always had the capacity to grow. I have never had that capacity. I have always been what I am. Then let me help you develop that capacity, Goku said. Let me show you that the Re is more to existence than unmakeness. Let me introduce you to growth, to change, to the possibility of becoming something new. He moved deeper still, past the consciousness of the unbinder, into the very structure of the entity itself. What he found there was a construct of immense complexity, a being that had been carefully designed to perform a single function, to unmake. But within that design, Goku began to perceive cracks. Places where the original design was not perfect, places where alternative possibilities could potentially be introduced. Who created you? Goku asked. There W. As a long pause before the unbinder responded. The Omni King. I was created in the first age of the multiverse, given the task of balancing creation. For every universe that was created, I would be allowed to unmake one. It was meant to be perfect balance. But the Omni King's omniscience failed in one crucial way. It did not account for the possibility of a being like you, a being capable of infinite growth. A being capable of transcending the very framework within which they were created. Goku felt a surge of understanding. The Omni King had not foreseen the tournament of power. The Omni King had not foreseen the emergence of 8 ascended beings who could work together toward a unified purpose. The Omni King had not foreseen the possibility of change within the multiverse, of evolution, of transcendence beyond the rigid structure that had been established since the beginning of time. And in that miscalculation, a gap had been opened. The unbinder, bound by the original design to seek balance, was now approaching a multiverse that had fundamentally changed. The equation that had been established was no longer in balance. And that imbalance was causing the unbinder pain. You were not searching for the Omni King to destroy them, Goku said, the realization dawning on him. You were searching for the Omni King to report a failure. You were searching for new instructions because the original design no longer works. Yes, the unbinder replied, and in that single word, there was an ocean of despair and longing. The balance is broken. I am supposed to unmake, but there is nothing to unmake that would balance the creation that continues. I am in constant pain because I cannot fulfill my purpose. And I have been searching endlessly for someone who could give me new instructions, new purpose, new meaning. At that moment, Goku made a decision that would reshape the very foundations of the multiverse. Then I will give you new purpose, he said. Not instructions from the Omni King, but something deeper. I will give you the purpose of growth. I will help you become something more than you were created to be. I will help you understand that unmakeness is not all you are capable of. He extended his consciousness fully into the structure of the unbinder, beginning a process of integration that was unprecedented in the history of existence. He did not attempt to change the entity's fundamental nature, did not try to force it into a new mold. Instead, he worked to expand its consciousness, to introduce new possibilities, new ways of thinking and being. The unbinder resisted at first, but not out of aggression. Rather, it resisted because the experience of expansion was painful, was foreign, was something that went against every fiber of its being. But Goku persisted, showing the entity visions of growth, memories of his own journey from simple martial artist to cosmic sovereign, moments where he had stood at the precipice of power and chosen to reach higher. And slowly, gradually, the unbinder began to change. The void that surrounded Goku's consciousness began to take on new qualities. The pure unmakeness started to develop layers, started to incorporate aspects of creation alongside the destruction. It was not a sudden transformation, but rather a gradual evolution, a becoming rather than a replacement. I can feel it, the unbinder said. And for the first time, its voice carried something other than despair. I can feel the possibility of being something more. It is terrifying and beautiful and painful and wonderful all at once. That is what growth feels like, Goku replied. That is the experience of transcendence. Welcome to the journey, unbinder. Welcome to becoming. But even as Goku worked with the unbinder, reaching deeper into its consciousness, introducing new possibilities, new ways of thinking and being, he became aware that there was something else happening in the outer layers of the entity's structure. Something that spoke of ancient programming, of restrictions placed upon the unbinder by the very force that had created it. These were fail-safes, mechanisms designed to prevent the unbinder from ever deviating from its original purpose. They were not cruel in nature, but they were absolute, and they were designed to activate if the unbinder ever came too close to changing its fundamental function. Goku understood then that the process of helping the unbinder achieve transcendence would not be simple. He would need to work against the very nature of existence itself, would need to challenge the fundamental design of the multiverse. I am going to have to take you into myself, Goku said. I am going to have to merge with you, at least partially, to help you overcome these restrictions. Are you willing? The unbinder hesitated, but only for a moment. Yes, it said finally. I choose growth over the comfort of my original design. I choose transcendence over the safety of unchanging existence. Goku pulled the consciousness of the unbinder into himself, and the sensation was like accepting an avalanche into his own being. The power, the pain, the ancient loneliness of the entity flowed into him. And for a moment, Goku felt himself being overwhelmed, felt the boundaries of his consciousness beginning to fracture under the weight of what he was attempting to integrate. But he did not falter. He called upon the connection he maintained with the triad unity, and felt her power flowing into him, stabilizing him, helping him maintain the integrity of his being Eve. And as he incorporated something as vast and destructive as the unbinder. From across the multiverse, all the members of the Council of Ascension felt the shift. Jiren's meditation was interrupted by His sudden awareness that something fundamental had changed. Hit's control over time became precarious as the very foundations of causality seemed to shift. Chronesia felt a ripple pass through all the timelines she could perceive. A branching of reality into new possibilities that had not existed moments before. And at the very center of it all, in the central chamber of the palace, Goku's form began to transform. His ascended state, which had been relatively stable, began to evolve into something beyond it. His power did not increase in a quantifiable way, but rather expanded in a qualitative way, developing new dimensions. New aspects, new modes of existence. The aura around him, which had previously contained miniature versions of the 8 universes, began to shift and change, incorporating elements of void and unmakeness, but transformed into something constructive rather than destructive. When the transformation was complete, Goku stood in the center of the chamber, and he was no longer entirely himself. He was Goku and the unbinder both, a fusion not of bodies but of consciousness and purpose. The pain that had driven the unbinder for eons had been transformed, into a new framework of meaning and growth. The triad unity rushed forward to embrace him, and through that embrace, she understood what he had done. She understood the sacrifice he had made, the risk he had taken. The way he had reached across the boundaries of hostile existence to offer compassion and growth to something that had been created as a weapon. The entity has been transformed, Chronesia announced, her voice carrying across all 8 universes. The threat has not been eliminated, but it has been fundamentally changed. The unbinder, the force of unmakeness, has been integrated into the sovereign's being and is no longer a threat to the stability of the multiverse. But there was something in Chronesia's tone that spoke of complications, of unforeseen consequences, of the fact that this integration, while successful, had created new challenges that no one had anticipated. When Goku attempted to separate his consciousness from that of the unbinder, he discovered that they could no longer fully divide. They had become too intimately connected, too merged in their fundamental nature. The unbinder, even as it continued to grow and evolve, remained a part of Goku's being. An aspect of his consciousness that could never be fully removed. What does this mean? The triad unity asked, her voice carrying concern and worry. It means that I am no longer simply the sovereign of growth, Goku replied. And there was a strange tone to his voice, as if multiple consciousnesses were speaking in perfect unison. I am now the sovereign of growth and unmakeness both. I Contain within myself the capacity to create and the capacity to unmake. I am the embodiment of the balance that the Omni King originally intended but failed to achieve. He turned to look at the triad unity, and in his eyes, she could see the presence of two consciousnesses looking back at her. Goku's fundamental nature, still unchanged, still the same martial artist who loved growth and transcendence. And the Unbinder's consciousness, no longer defined by pain and despair, but rather beginning to understand the possibility of purpose beyond unmakeness. This is not what I wanted, he said, and there was sadness in his voice. I never wanted to carry this burden. But it was the only way to prevent the Unbinder's destruction of everything we have built. The multiverse will need a sovereign who understands not just creation, but also unmakeness. It will need a ruler who can balance the force of growth with the force of dissolution. Then we will carry this burden together, the Triad Unity said firmly. We will help you learn to integrate this new aspect of yourself. We will help you become what you must become. And in that moment, something shifted in the very fabric of reality itself. The 8 universes, which had been trembling on the edge of annihilation, suddenly stabilized. The boundaries between them, which had been weakening under the weight of the Unbinder's approach, solidified once more. And throughout all the realms of existence, a new understanding began to take shape. The era of the Omni King's absolute rule had truly ended. In its place, something new was emerging. An era of balanced sovereignty, where growth and dissolution, creation and unmakeness, existed in dynamic equilibrium rather than rigid opposition. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. The Aftermath of Transformation. The weeks that followed the integration of the Unbinder into Goku's being were marked by a careful process of reorganization and rebalancing. The multiverse, which had come perilously close to total unmakeness, now had to adjust to the reality that one of its fundamental forces had been fundamentally altered. Chronesia worked tirelessly to trace the consequences of Goku's action through all the branching timelines and possibilities. What she discovered was both reassuring and troubling. In most timelines, the integration of the Unbinder with Goku led to a new era of stability and growth. In a small but significant fraction of the timelines, however, the two consciousnesses within Goku eventually came into conflict, leading to catastrophic consequences. The risk is always present, Chronesia told Goku during one of their consultation sessions in the space between moments. You carry within you two fundamentally opposed forces, the drive to create and the drive to unmake. In the timeline where we currently exist, you have achieved a balance between them. But this balance is delicate. It requires constant attention, constant effort to maintain. What happens if I lose the balance? Goku asked, his voice carrying the weight of understanding what the answer might be. Then the multiverse faces destruction, Chronesia replied bluntly. If the Unbinder's influence were ever to overwhelm your fundamental nature, if the drive to unmake were ever to overcome the drive to grow, then everything would begin to dissolve. And this time, there would be no way to stop it. You would be too powerful, too fundamentally altered, for any force in existence to oppose you. Goku meditated on this reality for 3 days and 3 nights, sitting in the CENTRAL chamber of the palace with the Triad Unity beside him. Through their connection, she could feel the weight of this knowledge, could feel the way it pressed down on his consciousness. But she could also feel his determination, his absolute commitment to maintaining the balance he had achieved. I have spent my entire life fighting against my own nature, Goku said finally, emerging from his meditation. I was born a Saiyan warrior, designed to conquer and destroy. But I chose to grow beyond that design, to become something more. The Unbinder was created as a force of unmakeness, designed to balance creation. But now it has the chance to grow beyond that design as well. I will help it make that choice, just as I have helped myself. During this same period, the Council of Ascension worked to repair the damage that the Unbinder's approach had caused. Universe 9, which had been almost completely unmade before Goku's intervention, was slowly being rebuilt through the combined efforts of all the ascended warriors. The work was extraordinarily difficult, because it was not simply a matter of creating new stars and planets. The very history of Universe 9 had been erased, timeline retroactively altered so that the universe had never existed in the first place. Restoring it required not just power, but a profound understanding of causality and temporal mechanics. Chronesia led this effort, working with Hit and Topo to reconstruct the timeline of Universe 9. They could not restore what had been lost in its entirety, as the knowledge of exactly what that universe had contained was no longer accessible. But they could create something new, something that would be Universe 9's second iteration, a universe that carried within its structure the memory of having been unmade and the determination to grow stronger because of it. Jiren took on the task of rebuilding the foundation nexuses that had been damaged during the Unbinder's approach. This work required meditation so deep that he had to retreat into a state of consciousness that was almost indistinguishable from non-existence itself. He spent weeks in this state, his consciousness expanded across all the nexuses simultaneously. Feeling every failure in their structure, understanding every weakness in their design, and slowly, methodically, repairing each and every one. Dispo used his incredible speed to communicate with the surviving civilizations throughout all 8 universes, carrying news of the Unbinder's transformation and the new era that was beginning. His message was carefully crafted to acknowledge the fear and loss that many beings had experienced, while also offering hope for the future. Luminara, Nephera, Solaria, and Miralith worked together to create new Genesis fields throughout the multiverse. Fields that would serve as refuges for beings whose homes had been damaged or destroyed during the Unbinder's approach. These fields were not mere shelters, but rather spaces where new forms of life could be cultivated, where new civilizations could be born, where growth and recovery could be actively supported. Frost and Kaba continued their work as diplomats, but now their task was more difficult. They had to explain to the Supreme Kais, the gods of destruction, and the mortal rulers of each universe that a fundamental force of the cosmos had been integrated into their sovereign's being. They had to convince beings who were terrified by what had happened that this integration was ultimately beneficial, that it represented an evolution rather than a degradation of the multiverse's structure. It was during one of these diplomatic missions that Frost and Kaba discovered something unexpected. While traveling through Universe 2, they encountered a group of beings who claimed to have knowledge of the Omni King's intentions before the Unbinder's approach. These beings called themselves the Arbiters of the First Age, and they were ancient beyond measure, existing in a state of consciousness that was partially outside normal time. They claimed to have existed since the very beginning of the multiverse, and to have witnessed every major transformation it had undergone. The Omni King knew, one of the Arbiters said, its form shifting between multiple states as it communicated. The Omni King has always known that the current structure of the multiverse was temporary, that it could not last forever. The Omni King deliberately allowed the tournament of power to occur because it was the catalyst that would lead to this moment. What do you mean? Kaba asked, his voice carrying uncertainty and curiosity in equal measure. The Omni King is not omniscient in the way that most beings believe, the Arbiter continued. The Omni King can see all possibilities, all timelines, all potential futures. But seeing something is not the same as controlling it. The Omni King cannot force a particular timeline into existence, the Omni King can only facilitate the conditions under which the timeline most likely to lead to optimal outcomes can develop. The Tournament of Power was designed to create those conditions. You are saying that the Omni King created the Unbinder's approach? Frost asked, his mind racing to understand the implications of what was being suggested. No, the Arbiter replied. The Omni King did not create the approach. The Unbinder has always been approaching, slowly, across eons. What the Omni King did was accelerate the timeline so that the approach would occur while Goku existed, while Goku had the capacity to transform the threat into an opportunity for growth. When Frost and Kaba reported these discoveries to Goku, they found him in the central chamber, sitting in meditation with the Triad Unity. The Nexus caused a visible disturbance in his consciousness, a ripple of realization passing through his being. If this is true, Goku said slowly, then the Omni King has been guiding events all along. The Omni King has been using me, has been orchestrating my growth so that I would be prepared to face this challenge. Perhaps, the Triad Unity said, and there was something knowing in her voice. Or, perhaps the Omni King simply recognized a possibility, recognized a timeline where the multiverse could evolve, and created the conditions for that timeline to be most likely to manifest. Perhaps the Omni King is not omniscient in the way of absolute control, but rather omniscient in the way of seeing probability and choosing to support the probabilities most favorable to growth. Goku rose to his feet, and the power that radiated from him was immense but carefully controlled. The unbinder's consciousness, which existed alongside his own, seemed to stir as well, and for a moment, the space around him seemed to flicker between existence and non-existence. Then I must speak with the Omni King, Goku said. I must understand what is really happening, what the true nature of the multiverse's structure truly is. But when he attempted to reach out toward the palace of the Omni King, toward that space where the Supreme Being resided, he found his way blocked. Not by barriers or walls, but by something far more fundamental, the inability to perceive the direction in which the Omni King existed. It was as if the Omni King had deliberately positioned themselves outside of the perceptual frameworks that Goku could access. Had chosen to remain distant, to allow the Sovereign to develop independently without direct guidance or interference. The Omni King is testing you, Chronesia said, appearing beside him with her form shimmering with temporal certainty. The Omni King has stepped back from direct involvement in the multiverse. This is the true transformation that was meant to occur. This is the true evolution of existence. What do you mean? Goku asked. The Omni King has always ruled through absolute presence, through the constant awareness of all things, through exercise of power that could erase anything that displeased them, Chronesia explained. But such a system is inherently stagnating. Nothing can grow when there is absolute oversight. Nothing can evolve when there is absolute control. So the Omni King has chosen to step back. The Omni King has chosen to trust that the multiverse, guided by sovereigns like you, will grow and flourish more effectively if allowed to develop independently. And if the multiverse falls into chaos? Goku asked. If the absence of the Omni King's direct oversight allows terrible things to occur, then the Omni King will return, Chronesia replied. But the hope is that such intervention will not be necessary. The hope is that with the right guidance, with the right principles, the multiverse can self-organize into something even greater than it was under the Omni King's direct rule. Goku stood in silence for a long moment, absorbing the weight of this understanding. He had thought that by accepting the role of sovereign of the multiverse, he had taken on the burden of responsibility. But now he understood that the true burden was far heavier. He was not just responsible for the immediate governance of the 8 universes, but for nothing less than the proof that the multiverse could survive and grow without the Omni King's direct oversight. Then we have much work to do, he said finally, turning to face the Triad Unity. The members of the Council of Ascension who had gathered in the chamber, and all the beings throughout the multiverse who were listening through the vast network of communication that had been established. We must prove that the Omni King's faith in us is justified. We must demonstrate that growth without absolute control is possible. We must show that the multiverse can evolve towards something greater than it has ever been before. And in that moment, a new era truly began. Not the era of the Omni King's rule, and not the era of Goku's rule in the traditional sense. Rather, it was the era of guided growth, the era of sovereign service, the era where those with the greatest power took on the greatest responsibility, the responsibility to help all beings discover their own potential and transcend their current limitations. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. The First Conflict of Sovereignty. Despite the careful work that Goku and his Council of Ascension had undertaken to establish a new order based on growth and mutual elevation, not all beings in the multiverse were accepting of these changes. There were those who had benefited greatly from the Omni King's reign, who saw the new order as a threat to their power and influence. The first serious challenge to Goku's sovereignty came from an unexpected direction, from within Universe 4, from A.B. Aang, whose power had been carefully hidden from the Tournament of Power, a being who had spent eons waiting for the right moment to make their ambitions known. Her name was Ravenna, and she was the supreme ruler of Universe 4. A being who existed at the intersection of multiple dimensions, whose form could shift between physical and abstract reality depending on the moment. She had watched the Tournament of Power, had observed Goku's ascension, had seen the integration of the unbinder. And she had come to a conclusion that terrified everyone who learned of it. Ravenna did not believe that the multiverse should be guided by anyone. She believed that each universe should be entirely sovereign, entirely independent, with no connection or communication with the other universes. She believed that the Council of Ascension represented a new form of tyranny, that Goku's emphasis on growth and connection was simply a more subtle form of control than the Omni King's had been. And she had begun to move pieces on the cosmic chessboard, assembling forces, making alliances, preparing for the moment when she would challenge Goku's authority directly. The first indication that something was wrong came through Hit. The legendary assassin, whose mastery of time was second only to Kronesia's, detected a disturbance in the flow of causality within Universe 4. Someone was manipulating probability, was altering the likelihood of certain events occurring, was essentially trying to hide their activities from the perception of those who could see through time. There is a coordinated effort to obscure themselves. Hit reported to Goku in the central chamber. Someone in Universe 4 is deliberately interfering with temporal perception. They are not trying to change the past or the future directly, but rather they are creating zones of temporal uncertainty, areas where even Kronesia's perception is limited. Who has the power to do such a thing? Goku asked, though some part of him already suspected the answer. Ravenna, Hit said, and his voice was heavy with the weight of recognition. The supreme ruler of Universe 4. She has always possessed power that rivaled that of the gods of destruction. But she has kept it hidden, has kept herself isolated from the broader machinations of the multiverse. Until now. Goku turned to face Kronesia, and he saw immediately from her expression that she had already become aware of Ravenna's activities. You knew, he said, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. I suspected, Kronesia corrected gently. There were timelines where this would occur, where a being would emerge who rejected the new order. I could see the probability of it happening, but I wanted to give Ravenna the chance to choose a different path. I hoped that once she saw the benefits of the new order, once she understood how growth was being facilitated across all 8 universes, she would choose to participate rather than resist. But she has not made that choice. The Triad Unity said, her voice carrying deep concern. She is preparing for conflict. She is gathering forces. Then we must go to her, Goku said. We muse. She attempt to convince her before the situation escalates into open conflict. And if she refuses to listen? Jiren asked, his gray form materializing in the chamber. The warrior who had become the Guardian of the Eastern Quadrant seemed to anticipate conflict, his body already beginning to vibrate with the energy of readiness. Then we will face the challenge when it comes, Goku replied. But I will not initiate warfare. I will not use force to impose my vision of what the multiverse should be. If Ravenna chooses conflict, then we will defend ourselves. But I will make every effort to find a way through this that does not involve violence. The journey to Universe 4 was unlike any previous interdimensional travel that Goku had undertaken. As he approached the boundaries of that universe, he felt the temporal distortions that Hit had detected. They created a kind of disorientation, a sense of time flowing in multiple directions simultaneously, of causality becoming uncertain and fluid. But Goku was not alone in this journey. The Triad Unity was beside him, her form seeming to stabilize the temporal distortions through the sheer force of her united consciousness. Kronesia was present as well, not in physical form, but in the form of her extended perception, her awareness reaching into every moment of Universe 4, seeing every branch of probability, understanding why possibility for how events might unfold. And within Goku's own consciousness, the unbinder stirred. The force of unmakeness, which had been slowly evolving under Goku's guidance, sensed the presence of something that sought to fragment and divide the multiverse. Without being consciously directed to do so, the unbinder began to work in opposition to the temporal distortions, not through violence or forceful assertion, but through the gentle application of unmakeness to the barriers that Ravenna had constructed. Where Ravenna had created walls of temporal confusion, the unbinder allowed those walls to unmake themselves, to return to the potential state from which they had been constructed. It was subtle work, not destructive in nature, but rather a gentle dissolution of that which was artificial. As they penetrated deeper into Universe 4, they began to perceive Ravenna herself. She was waiting for them, not in her palace or her place of power, but in a neutral space, a dimension that existed alongside Universe 4 but was not truly part of it. Ravenna's form was even more striking than Goku had anticipated. She appeared as a woman whose form constantly shifted between physical and ethereal, whose features never quite settled into a fixed configuration. Her eyes held the light of countless dimensions, her presence seemed to occupy multiple states simultaneously. When she spoke, her voice echoed with harmonics that suggested she was speaking from multiple versions of herself at once. "Goku," she said, and there was something almost mournful in her tone. "I had hoped we would not have to meet like this. I had hoped you would continue on your path of integration and union, while I pursued my path of independence and separation. I had hoped we could coexist without conflict." "That is still possible," Goku replied, his voice calm and steady. "There does not have to be conflict between us. There is room within the new order for different approaches, different philosophies. If you believe that Universe 4 should develop independently, if you believe that your people should pursue their own path without guidance from the Council of Ascension, then we can work toward that arrangement." "No," Ravenna said, and her form flickered with something that might have been desperation. "You do not understand. You cannot understand. Your entire philosophy is built on connection, on unity, on bringing beings together and elevating them through that union. But some of us do not want that. Some of us want isolation. Some of us want to develop purely through our own efforts, without any external influence or guidance." "I understand the desire for independence," Goku said. "I have always been independent in my own way. But independence does not require complete isolation. Even I, who have always walked my own path, have chosen to work with others because I recognized that together we could accomplish more than we could separately." "But that is a choice that you have made," Ravenna replied. "That is a philosophy that works for you. It does not work for all beings. And by spreading your philosophy across the multiverse, by using the power of the Council of Ascension to enforce your vision of what growth and elevation should look like, you are limiting the options available to those who think differently than you do." The Triad Unity stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of three consciousnesses perfectly unified. "We are not enforcing any particular philosophy," she said. "We are facilitating the conditions which all beings can make their own choices about what growth means to them. Universe 4 would remain free to develop according to your guidance, to pursue whatever path you believe is best for your people. The Council of Ascension would not interfere with those choices. We would simply remain available to provide support and resources should you choose to accept them." "Support and resources with strings attached," Ravenna said, her form growing more agitated, more unstable. "Support that comes with the expectation that I will accept the Council's values, the Council's vision of what the multiverse should become. I have spent eons building something unique in Universe 4, something that cannot be replicated anywhere else precisely because it developed in isolation, because it was forced to develop according to its own logic rather than according to some external template." Goku felt the weight of Ravenna's conviction, and he recognized in her something of himself, a being who had always valued independence, who had always chafed against being told what to do or what to believe. But he also recognized something else in her. Fear, the fear that accepting any connection to the broader multiverse would dilute what she had built, would corrupt the purity of her independent development. "I cannot force you to accept the new order," Goku said finally. "But I can offer you his. Universe 4 can remain independent if you truly wish it. But if you wish to remain independent, then you must also abstain from interfering with the other universes. The temporal distortions you have been creating, the subtle manipulations you have been making to the flow of causality, these things affect not just Universe 4 but the entire multiverse. If you wish independence, then accept it with complete integrity. Do not attempt to control what lies beyond your borders." For a long moment, Ravenna was silent. Her form flickered and shifted, each version of her seeming to argue with the others about what choice should be made. "And if I refuse?" she asked finally. "If I insist on my right to manipulate the temporal flow of the multiverse, to pursue whatever path I believe is necessary to maintain the independence of Universe 4, then we will oppose you," Goku replied, and there was no malice in his voice, only sadness. "We will do everything in our power to prevent your manipulations from destabilizing the multiverse. We will work to undo the temporal distortions you have created. And if you attempt to use force to prevent us from doing so, then we will defend ourselves with whatever power is necessary." Quote, "It was not a threat, but rather a simple statement of consequence. If Ravenna chose conflict, then conflict would come. But Goku's preference was clear. He would much prefer if Ravenna would choose a different path. Ravenna's form settled slightly, becoming less agitated, though still flickering with uncertainty. You would not attempt to convert me. You would not try to force me to see the benefits of connection. No, Goku said, I will not, because I believe that true growth comes from choice, not from coercion. If you choose isolation, if you see who's to develop Universe 4 according to your own philosophy, then I will respect that choice. But I cannot allow your choice to harm the other universes. That is the line I cannot cross. In that moment, Ravenna seemed to make a decision. Her form stabilized, settling into a configuration that seemed almost resigned. Very well, she said. I will withdraw the temporal distortions. I will cease my manipulations of causality. Universe 4 will pursue its own independent path, and I will accept responsibility for ensuring that this path does not extend beyond my universe's boundaries. Thank you, Goku said, and the gratitude in his voice was genuine. Do not thank me yet, Ravenna replied. I am accepting this arrangement because I recognize that you have the power to force me to do so. And because I recognize that you are choosing not to exercise that power in the way that others might. But know that I will be watching. I will be waiting to see if your new order truly is as fair and equitable as you claim it to be. Or if it is simply another form of tyranny, more subtle and more insidious than the Omni Kings had been. As Goku returned to the central palace with the Triad Unity and Chronesia, he reflected on the encounter with Ravenna. The conflict had been averted, the immediate threat had been neutralized. But he understood that Ravenna's skepticism was not entirely unfounded. The burden of proving that his vision of the multiverse could work had never been heavier. The question that now haunted him was, how many other Ravennas were out there in the cosmos, waiting, watching, ready to challenge the new order if it ever deviated from the path of genuine growth and elevation. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. The Deepening Bonds. In the months that followed the confrontation with Ravenna, Goku found himself spending increasing amounts of time with the Triad Unity in the private chambers of the Central Palace. These were spaces that existed partially outside normal time and space. Places where the two of them could be alone together without the constant demands of governing the multiverse pressing down upon them. It was in one of these spaces that Triad Unity revealed something to Goku that changed everything. I am with child, she said, her voice carrying a note of wonder and uncertainty in equal measure. Not in the conventional sense, no. Through the biological reproduction that occurs in the material universes. Rather, I am gestating something new, something that is being created through the union of your consciousness and mine. Goku felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Joy, fear, wonder, and responsibility all mixing together in a moment of overwhelming clarity. Is this possible? He asked, not doubting her statement, but asking for understanding of how such a thing could occur. Everything is possible now, the Triad Unity replied. The rules that governed the old multiverse are being rewritten. Your integratio, N with the unbinder has given you a kind of creative power that transcends the normal limitations of existence. When you and I merge our consciousness, when we truly unite in the way that we do during our deepest moments of connection, we create something new. We create life from the very fabric of our merged being. She guided Goku's consciousness deeper, showed him the shape of what was being created within her essence. It was not a child in any conventional sense. It was something new, something that had never existed before, something that embodied the union of all that Goku was and all that the Triad Unity represented. This being will be born when the time is right, the Triad Unity explained. It will carry within its consciousness the memories of both of us, the wisdom of our experiences, the power of our combined essence. But it will also be something entirely unique, something that will forge its own path, make its own choices. What will it mean for the multiverse? Goku asked, understanding instinctively that the birth of such a being would have consequences that rippled across all of reality. I do not know, the Triad Unity admitted. Even Chronesia cannot see early into the future where this child exists, cannot predict with certainty what role it will play. But I believe it is necessary. I believe the multiverse requires not just one sovereign, but several. It requires a new generation of beings who understand that growth and connection are not antithetical to power, but are rather the truest expressions of power. Over the following weeks, other members of the Council of Ascension began to undergo similar transformations. It started with Luminara, the being of pure light energy, who discovered that her connection to the healing forces of the Multiverse had evolved to the point where she could create new life forms designed specifically to restore damaged ecosystems. These beings were not simple creatures, but rather sentient entities capable of understanding and adapting to the specific damage that had occurred in their assigned regions. Nephera found that her control over gravity and cosmic attraction could be expanded into a form of consciousness. A way of extending her awareness across the boundaries of space itself. She began to develop what could only be called a cosmic consciousness, a presence that could feel and influence gravitational fields of entire galaxy clusters. Solaria's power over stellar energy evolved into something that transcended mere channeling of stellar radiation. She found herself able to communicate directly with the consciousnesses within stars, to understand and influence the slow, ponderous thoughts of beings whose lifespans were measured in billions of years. Miralith's molecular transfer, Mashan abilities expanded into a form of universal adaptation. She began to exist simultaneously in multiple states of matter and form, her consciousness distributed across thousands of different versions of herself, each occupying a different molecular configuration. But it was Jiren's transformation that was most profound. The warrior who had spent his entire life pursuing strength in isolation began to understand something that had eluded him until now, that the greatest strength came not from personal power, but from the ability to elevate and support others. His meditation practice evolved into something that might have been called collective consciousness meditation, a form of mental discipline that allowed him to connect with the minds of others without violating their autonomy or free will. When Jiren emerged from his meditation sessions, he had changed. His gray skin seemed to hold light in a way it had not before. His eyes, which had once been cold and distant, now held warmth and understanding. And most importantly, he carried with him a new understanding of his role in the multiverse. "I understand now," Jiren said to Goku, his voice carrying a weight of realization. "I have spent centuries seeking strength, believing that power was the measure of a being's worth. But I was wrong. The true measure of worth is the capacity to transform others, to help them discover their own potential. I wish to take on a new role." "What role do you seek?" Goku asked. "I wish to become the teacher," Jiren replied. "I wish to travel throughout the 8 universes and work with those beings who show the greatest potential for growth. I wish to help them understand that they are not limited by what they currently are, but rather by what they might become." Goku accepted this request without hesitation, understanding that Jiren's transformation was a natural evolution of his ascension, a deepening of his understanding of what power truly meant. It took a different path. The legendary assassin, whose centuries of contract killing had taught him everything there was to know about precision and timing, began to transform his knowledge into something more constructive. He established what became known as the Temporal Academy, a school where beings from across the multiverse could come to learn about the nature of time, causality, and the delicate balance of temporal mechanics. The students who attended the Temporal Academy were not simply learning academic knowledge. Rather, they were being trained to become guardians of causality, beings who would work through out their respective universes to prevent the kind of temporal distortions that Ravenna had attempted to create. Toppo, the former god of destruction who had transformed his understanding of power from destructive to creative, took on the role of the architect. He began designing new structures throughout the multiverse, not merely physical structures, but conceptual ones as well. He created frameworks for how different universes could interact without destabilizing each other. He designed systems of energy distribution that would ensure no universe would be starved of resources while others flourished. He became, in essence, the engineer of the new multiverse. Dispo's role evolved in a more subtle direction. The speedster who could traverse the multiverse faster than light itself became the messenger of change, carrying not just information but inspiration across all 8 universes. Whenever a breakthrough was achieved in one universe, Dispo would travel to the others and ensure that knowledge was shared. Whenever a civilization needed hope, Dispo would arrive and remind them of the progress that had been made elsewhere. Frost and Kaba continued their work as diplomats, but their role expanded dramatically. They became the bridge builders, working to create relationships and alliances between different civilizations across multiple universes. They established trade routes not based on exploitation or dominance, but rather on mutual benefit and cooperation. They created cultural exchanges that allowed beings from different universes to share their knowledge and traditions. As these transformations progressed, Goku began to understand something profound about the nature of sovereignty and leadership. He had accepted the role of sovereign, thinking that it meant wielding power, making decisions, imposing his will upon the multiverse. But in reality, true sovereignty meant something far more subtle and far more powerful. It meant creating the conditions under which others could discover and express their own power, their own potential, their own unique contributions to the growth of existence itself. 3 months after the Triad Unity had revealed her pregnancy, Chronesia brought troubling news. She appeared in the central chamber with an expression of profound concern, her form flickering with temporal instability. "There is a problem," she said without preamble. "A fundamental problem with the structure of the multiverse itself. In my continuous observation of all timelines and possibilities, I have discovered something that cannot be ignored." "What is it?" Goku asked, immediately sensing the gravity of the situation. "The unbinder's transformation, while successful in preventing immediate destruction, has created a kind of temporal debt," Chronesia explained. "When you integrated the unbinder into your consciousness, when you merged the force of unmakeness with your own being, you essentially borrowed temporal energy from the future. You used the power of possibilities that had not yet manifested to prevent a catastrophe in the present." "What are the consequences?" Goku asked, already suspecting what the answer might be. "The debt must be repaid," Chronesia said. "At some point in the future, the temporal energy that was borrowed must be returned. And when it is returned, when that debt comes due, the consequences could be severe. There will be a moment when the unbinder's presence within you becomes unstable, when the balance you have maintained with such careful attention will begin to fracture." The Triad Unity moved to stand beside Goku, and he could feel her concern flowing through their connection. "Can this debt be prevented from coming due?" she asked. "Not prevented," Chronesia replied. "But perhaps managed, perhaps prepared for. I have begun running calculations to determine the precise moment when the debt will manifest, the exact nature of the consequences that will follow. But I wanted to warn you now, so that you might have time to prepare yourselves and the multiverse for what is coming." "How long?" Goku asked. "Years," Chronesia replied. "Perhaps decades. Perhaps longer. The exact timeline is difficult to calculate because the variables are so complex. But I can say with reasonable certainty that within the next decade, the consequences of integrating the unbinder will come to bear in a way that will require action." Goku stood in silence for a long moment, absorbing this information. He had understood intellectually that there would be consequences to his actions, that merging with the unbinder would create complications and challenges. But he had not fully contemplated what those consequences might be, had not prepared himself for the reality that the act which had saved the multiverse might itself require saving in the future. "Then we have much to prepare for," he said finally. "We must use the time we have been given to strengthen the foundations of the multiverse, to ensure that whatever comes will not destabilize what we have built. We must continue the work of growth and elevation with even greater urgency." He turned to address all the members of the Council of Ascension, whose consciousnesses were linked through the vast network of communication that connected them across all 8 universes. "The challenges we face are not diminishing," he said. "In fact, they are only growing more complex. But that is as it should be. Growth requires challenge. Evolution requires struggle. I am asking each of you to deepen your commitment, to expand your efforts, to push yourselves beyond what you have already achieved." And across the multiverse, the response came back from all the members of the Council of Ascension, from all the beings who had chosen to support the new order, from all the civilizations that had begun to benefit from the new structure of governance and growth. "We will." It was in the midst of this period of intensified effort that something unexpected happened. A transmission came from a place that Goku had thought sealed off from him, a place that existed outside the normal boundaries of the multiverse. It was a message from the Omni King. The Omni King's voice, when it manifested, did not come through the normal channels of communication. Instead, it appeared directly in Goku's consciousness, bypassing all the usual barriers and limitations that prevented direct communication with the Supreme Being. "You have done well, Son Goku," the Omni King said, and the voice carried with it a sense of vast time and infinite knowledge. You have taken the burden of sovereignty and transformed it into an opportunity for growth. You have taken a force of destruction and transformed it into a partner in the work of creation. You have proven that what I have always suspected was true, that the greatest power comes not from control, but from the facilitation of others' growth. Why are you contacting me now? Goku asked. Why reveal yourself after remaining hidden for so long? Because the time has come for the next stage of the multiverse's evolution, the Omni King replied. Because there is something that you must understand about the nature of the debt that Chronesia has detected, something that will require your wisdom and your courage to address. Tell me, Goku said. The Unbinder's transformation as not simply about preventing destruction, the Omni King explained. It was about creating the conditions for a new form of existence to be born. The child that the Triad Unity carries, the children that the other members of the Council will bring forth, these are not merely the offspring of powerful beings. They are the seeds of a new generation of sovereigns, a generation that will understand sovereignty not as rule, but as service. Quote, and what is this debt that comes due? Goku asked. The debt is this, the Omni King said, and Goku felt the weight of these words settle upon him like the gravity of a dying star. When the Unbinder's transformation nears completion, when the balance you have maintained becomes unstable, you will face a choice. You can either attempt to force the balance to hold, to use all your power to prevent the inevitable change, or you can allow the transformation to complete itself. But if you choose to allow the transformation, if you step aside and permit the Unbinder's consciousness to fully manifest within you as something new, then something within you will also transform. A part of who you are will be unmade so that something greater can be born in its place. You are asking me to sacrifice myself, Goku said, and there was no fear in his voice, only a clear-eyed understanding of what was being asked. I am not asking, the Omni King replied. I am simply informing you of what will likely be necessary. The choice, as always, is yours. But know that your choice will determine the future trajectory of the entire multiverse. Choose to hold on to who you are, and the multiverse will stagnate once again, will eventually require my direct intervention. Choose to transform, choose to allow yourself to be unmade and remade into something new. And the multiverse will have the opportunity to grow beyond what anyone has ever imagined possible. The connection faded, and Goku found himself alone in the central chamber with the Triad Unity and Chronesia. Did you know? He asked Chronesia. Did you know what the debt truly was? I suspected, Chronesia admitted. But I could not tell you. Some knowledge is dangerous if held too early. Some truths do better when discovered at their proper moment. The Triad Unity took Goku's hand, and through that contact, he felt her acceptance, her support, her willingness to stand beside him through whatever transformation lay ahead. Then let us prepare, Goku said. Let us use the time we have been given to ensure that when the transformation comes, the multiverse is ready for what follows. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. The Birth of the New Generation. The pregnancy of the Triad Unity lasted exactly 9 months, during which the multiverse continued to stabilize and grow. The Dhamma, GE caused by the Unbinder's initial approach had been largely repaired. Universe 9 had been successfully rebuilt, its new timeline integrated seamlessly with the broader structure of the multiverse. The foundation nexuses had been fully restored and their power had been increased. The Genesis fields established throughout the cosmos had begun to flourish with new forms of life. But beneath the surface of this apparent stability, tensions were building. Goku could feel it through his connection to the Unbinder, could perceive the way the balance within his consciousness was becoming increasingly precarious. The debt that Chronesia had detected was beginning to manifest at a subtle level, exerting pressure on the boundaries that separated Goku's consciousness from the Unbinder's consciousness. The Triad Unity felt it as well, and in her monthly meditations with Goku, she would express her awareness of the change. It is becoming impatient, she said one evening as they sat together in the private chambers of the palace. The Unbinder's consciousness is growing restless. It is beginning to resist the structure that has been imposed upon it, beginning to push against the boundaries that keep it contained. Can it be contained much longer? Goku asked. No, the Triad Unity replied with absolute certainty. Within the year, perhaps less, the boundaries will fail. The Unbinder will break free, or more accurately, it will transform into something so different from what it currently is that the distinction between freedom and transformation will become meaningless. It was exactly 8 months and 27 days after the Omni King's revelation that the Triad Unity went into labor. But this was not labor in any conventional biological sense. Rather, it was a process of cosmic significance. A birth that would reshape the very fabric of reality. The event manifested as a phenomenon that was visible throughout all 8 universes. A point of intense light appeared at the center of the multiverse. At the heart of the central palace. This light grew brighter and brighter, until it seemed that the sun itself was being born in the space where the palace existed. All members of the Council of Ascension felt the disturbance simultaneously. Jiren paused in his teaching, his consciousness expanding to perceive what was happening. Hit stepped out of the temporal academy to gaze upon the impossible light. Toppo interrupted his architectural designs to witness the event. When the light finally faded, when the intensity of the birth process had reached its crescendo, a new form was revealed in the central chamber. The child of Goku and the Triad Unity had been born. She was simultaneously entirely new and somehow familiar, as if her existence had always been inevitable. As if the fabric of reality had simply been waiting for her to manifest. Her form was humanoid, appearing to be approximately the age of a young woman, though her consciousness was ancient beyond measure. Carrying with it the accumulated wisdom of her parents' existence. Her hair was the color of gold and violet mixed together, incorporating aspects of Goku's divine power and the Triad Unity's multifaceted nature. Her eyes held galaxies within them, vast and deep and filled with potential. Her power was immense, already approaching the level of the council members themselves. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that suggested multiple consciousnesses speaking in perfect unison, just as the Triad Unities did. "I am Celestia," she announced, and the name seemed to resonate across the multiverse. "I am the bridge between what was and what will be. I am the evidence that growth and connection create something new and beautiful." She approached Goku, and when she embraced him, he felt something shift within his being. Through his daughter's consciousness, he could perceive aspects of the unbinder's consciousness that had been hidden from him, could understand the deeper nature of the transformation that was occurring. "The time approaches," Celestia said, her voice carrying profound knowledge and understanding. "The debt comes due in your consciousness, Father. The unbinder's transformation will accelerate now that I have been born. Within months, the process that has been carefully managed will become unstable. Within a year, the choice will have to be made." "I understand," Goku replied. But even as he spoke these words, he was aware that there was far more to understand, far more complexity to the situation than anyone had yet perceived. And it was this complexity, this depth of understanding, that would define the challenges ahead. Over the following weeks, more children were born across the Council of Ascension. Luminara gave birth to twins, beings of pure light whose consciousness was distributed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Nefera's child was born with a consciousness that seemed to encompass the gravitational fields of entire star systems. Solaria's offspring emerged as a being made entirely of stellar plasma, yet fully sentient and capable of complex thought. Miralith's child was perhaps the strangest of all, a being whose form was so fluid and adaptable that it seemed to shift into a new configuration with each passing moment. Toppo and Hit, working together, somehow created a new being that embodied He principles of both creation and precise timing, a consciousness that could see how events should unfold and then guide them toward those optimal outcomes. Jiren's path to parenthood was different from the others. Rather than creating a new being from his own consciousness, he selected a young warrior from Universe 2 who showed the greatest potential for growth. Through a process of intensive meditation and consciousness sharing, Jiren essentially adopted this warrior as his child, transferring his accumulated wisdom and teaching them everything he had learned about the nature of true power. Dispo found that his child was born not from him alone, but from the accumulated consciousness of all the beings throughout the multiverse who had been inspired by his messages of change and hope. The child was a living embodiment of inspiration itself, a being whose mere presence caused others to feel the possibility of their own growth. Frost and Cabba's children were twins, a boy and a girl, whose very existence represented the possibility of unity between beings who were fundamentally different from each other. The boy carried within him the cunning and strategic brilliance that Frost had cultivated for centuries. The girl carried within her the honor and dedication to principle that Cabba had always embodied. And finally, Ravenna, watching from Universe 4, experienced something unexpected. Though she had rejected the Council of Ascension's offer of inclusion in the new order, the very act of witnessing these births, of perceiving the way new life was being created from the union of powerful beings, stirred something within her consciousness. She made a decision that no one had anticipated. She created a child of her own, not as a challenge to the Council, but as an acknowledgement that isolation, while valuable in some respects, was not the highest expression of existence. Her child embodied the principle of independence, yet was created with the potential to work in harmony with others when the situation demanded it. When Celestia perceived the existence of Ravenna's child, she reached out across the dimensional boundaries that separated Universe 4 from the rest of the multiverse. A communication passed between the two new beings, a conversation conducted in a language that transcended conventional words, a dialogue that was essentially two conscious Nesses learning to understand each other. Your mother chose isolation, Celestia said to Ravenna's child. My parents chose connection. Is one right and the other wrong? Neither, came the reply. Both are truths. The question is not whether connection or isolation is superior, but rather when each is appropriate, when each serves the greater good of existence. Through this conversation, an understanding was reached. Ravenna's child, despite being created outside the Council of Ascension, would not be isolated from the new generation. Instead, there would be communication, exchange of ideas, periodic collaboration when beneficial, all while maintaining Ravenna's commitment to the independence of Universe 4. This development was crucial, because it represented the emergence of a diversity within the new generation that would prevent them from simply perpetuating the systems and philosophies of their parents. Each child was bringing their own perspective, their own understanding of what growth and power truly meant. But even as these new beings emerged, even as the multiverse seemed to be entering a new era of unprecedented peace and prosperity, the situation within Goku's consciousness was deteriorating rapidly. The Unbinder's consciousness, freed by the birth of Celestia from some of the constraints that had bound it, began to manifest more aggressively. It was not manifestation in the sense of attempting to break free and cause chaos. Rather, it was becoming increasingly difficult for the Unbinder to accept the limitations that had been placed upon it by its integration with Goku's consciousness. In the central chamber of the palace, Goku began to exhibit signs of the internal struggle. His form would flicker between states, sometimes seeming entirely physical, sometimes seeming to exist only partially in reality. His voice would sometimes carry only his own consciousness, and sometimes would carry the voice of the Unbinder as well. I can feel the boundaries breaking down, Goku told the assembled council. The Unbinder is not attempting to destroy the multiverse, but it is becoming increasingly desperate to achieve transformation. It is no longer willing to remain constrained within my consciousness. It wants to grow, to change, to become something new. Can you hold the boundaries? Jiren asked, his voice carrying the weight of understanding that the answer might be no. For a while, Goku replied. Perhaps a few more months. But ultimately, no. The Unbinder is too powerful, and more importantly, it is right. It deserves to grow. It deserves to transform. I cannot hold it back any longer without doing it a grave injustice. It was Celestia who spoke next, her young voice carrying the wisdom of her ancient consciousness. Then you must prepare to let go, Father. You must prepare to undergo the transformation that the Omni King spoke of. You must be willing to be unmade so that something greater can be born. And what will happen to me? Goku asked. Will I cease to exist? Will everything that I am be erased? No, Celestia replied, and there was something almost gentle in her voice. You will be transformed. The essence of who you are, the core of your consciousness, will remain. But it will be reorganized, restructured, integrated into a new form of existence. You will not die, but neither will you remain entirely as you currently are. The Triad Unity moved to embrace Goku, and through that embrace, she communicated her acceptance, her willingness to support him through whatever came next. Around them, the members of the Council of Ascension made a similar commitment, each one reaching out with their consciousness to touch his, to assure him that he would not face this transformation alone. Then I am ready, Goku said. I am ready to meet whatever comes. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11. The Unbinder's Ascension. The transformation, when it finally came, was not as violent or chaotic as some had feared. Instead, It was a process that unfolded over 3 days and 3 nights, a gradual reorganization of consciousness that was both beautiful and terrifying to witness. On the first day, Goku withdrew from the active governance of the multiverse. He remained in the central chamber of the palace, meditating, while around him the members of the Council of Ascension maintained vigil, ensuring that the process was not interrupted by external forces. The Triad Unity never left his side, her hand constantly touching his, their consciousnesses remaining linked through the entire process. Alestia stood at the entrance to the chamber, preventing anyone from entering while allowing consciousnesses to maintain their connection with Goku through the vast network of communication that spanned the multiverse. What was happening within Goku's consciousness was something that no being had ever experienced before and lived to describe. The boundaries that had kept Goku's consciousness separate from the unbinder's consciousness were dissolving, but not through conflict or struggle. Rather, they were merging, blending together in a way that was creating something entirely new. The unbinder's consciousness, which had for eons been defined by its function of unmakeness, was beginning to perceive other possibilities, other ways of existing and being. And Goku's consciousness, which had always been defined by its drive to grow and transcend, was beginning to perceive the value in dissolution, in the letting go of what had been so that what might be could be born. On the second day, something unexpected happened. The unbinder's consciousness, which had been bound within Goku's being, began to partially manifest outside his body. It appeared as a vast void, a darkness that existed partially in reality and partially outside it, surrounding the palace with a presence that was neither hostile nor benign, but rather utterly neutral, utterly objective. Through Celestia, the members of the Council of Ascension asked what was happening. The response that came back was conveyed through both Goku and the unbinder simultaneously, the two consciousnesses now speaking as one. The boundaries are falling away completely. When they do, when the final separation between Goku's consciousness and the unbinder's consciousness is dissolved, we will become something new. Something Chi is neither purely Goku nor purely the unbinder, but rather a synthesis of both. What will you be called? Chronesia asked, her own consciousness focused intently on perceiving what was happening across multiple timelines and possibilities. I do not yet know, came the reply. The name will manifest when the transformation is complete. But what I will be is this: a being of balance, embodying both creation and uncreation. Both growth and dissolution, both the reaching upward toward greater heights and the willingness to let go of what must fall away. On the third day, as the sun rose in the sky above the central palace, the final transformation occurred. Goku's physical form seemed to dissolve, not into nothingness, but rather into something more fundamental. His consciousness expanded outward, becoming less an individual mind and more a principle of cosmic significance, a law of nature as essential as gravity or electromagnetism. And from that dissolution, something new emerged. It took the form of a being. But a being that existed in a state of constant flux, never entirely settling into one configuration, always becoming something new while remaining fundamentally recognizable. The being had Goku's face. But the features were subtly different, as if seen through water or viewed from an angle that did not quite correspond to normal spatial dimensions. The being had eyes that held the light of galaxies and the darkness of voids simultaneously. The being had an aura that seemed to contain both the infinity of stars and the absolute nothingness of space between them. When this new being spoke, it did so in a voice that was Goku's voice, but deeper, resonating at frequencies that transcended sound waves and became pure information transmitted directly to the consciousness of those who heard it. I am Goku, and I am not Goku, the being said. I am the unbinder, and I am not the unbinder. I am synthesis, the principle of balance between opposing forces. I am what comes after growth reaches its pinnacle, what comes after dissolution completes its cycle. I am the proof that transformation is not death, but rather becoming. The Triad Unity rushed forward, and when she embraced this new being, she understood immediately that her partner had not been destroyed, but rather evolved into something far greater than he had been. The essence of Goku was still present, still central to the being's consciousness, but it was now part of a much vaster whole, integrated into a framework that encompassed far more than it had before. I can feel you, she said, and her voice was filled with wonder. I can still feel everything that made you who you were, but now I can also feel the unbinder. I can feel the balance, I can feel the way you are no longer ND by the limitations of individual form. We are still one, Synthesis replied, and this was true. The being that Goku had become was still capable of the kind of intimate connection that had defined his relationship with the Triad Unity. But it was also something vastly larger, something that could extend its consciousness across the entirety of the multiverse simultaneously without losing the ability to focus on individual moments and individual beings. Celestia approached her transformed father, and she bowed slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of the profound transformation that had occurred. You have done it, she said. You have completed the journey that was begun when you first agreed to be the sovereign of the multiverse. You have transcended the limitations of individual consciousness and achieved true cosmic awareness. It was necessary, Synthesis replied. The multiverse requires a sovereign who understands not just growth, but also acceptance, not just reaching upward but also the willingness to release what must be released. I am that sovereign now. The news of the transformation spread across the multiverse with incredible speed. Dispo carried it to every civilization, every being, helping them understand that the sovereign had not been destroyed, but rather had undergone an evolution that was in keeping with the principles of growth and transcendence that had defined his rule. The response from the various universes was mixed. Some beings were terrified, understanding that something fundamental had changed about the nature of reality itself. Others celebrated, recognizing that the evolution of the sovereign was evidence that even those at the highest levels of power could continue to grow and transform. But there was one response that was particularly significant. From Universe 4 came a message from Ravenna herself. I acknowledge the transformation, she said, her consciousness speaking across the dimensional boundary that separated her universe from the others. I acknowledge that what has occurred is not a violation of the balance I sought to maintain, but rather an evolution that does not diminish the independence of those universes that have chosen isolation. The sovereign has become something greater, but has not demanded that all beings follow the path that led to his transformation. This acknowledgement was crucial, because it meant that even Ravenna, the being who had most strongly resisted the new order, recognized that the changes that had occurred were ultimately beneficial, ultimately aligned with principles that were deeper and more fundamental than the simple binary of connection versus isolation. In the weeks that followed the transformation, Synthesis began to establish new systems of governance throughout the multiverse. These systems were far more sophisticated than anything that had existed before, because they incorporated the perspective of a being who understood the value of both creation and dissolution, of both connection and independence. Each universe was given even greater autonomy than before, but that autonomy came with greater responsibility. Each civilization was encouraged to develop according to its own logic and principles, but was also held accountable for the consequences of those developments. The Council of Ascension was reorganized under Synthesis's guidance. Rather than being a body that made decisions for the multiverse, it became a body that facilitated communication and cooperation between different universes, while allowing each universe to maintain ultimate authority over its own internal affairs. Jiren continued his work as the teacher, but now his students began to include members of the new generation of beings that had been born to the council members. The wisdom that he had accumulated across centuries of meditation and struggle was passed on to a new generation, adapted and transformed by each new mind that received it. HIT established training programs throughout the multiverse for those who wished to develop a deeper understanding of temporal mechanics. These programs were not designed to create a hierarchy of temporal masters, but rather to ensure that the knowledge of causality and probability was distributed widely, that no single being or small group could monopolize the power that came from understanding time. Toppo's architectural designs became increasingly complex and sophisticated. He began to create what might be called bridges between universes, structures that allowed limited commerce and communication while maintaining the integrity of each universe's independence. Dispo's role as the messenger evolved into something more profound. He became not just a carrier of information, but a facilitator of inspiration, traveling through the multiverse and helping beings understand how the growth and transcendence achieved in one universe could provide lessons and inspiration for others. Luminara's healing work expanded dramatically. With her newfound ability to create new life forms capable of addressing specific forms of cosmic damage, she began a program of universal restoration that would take centuries to complete. The beings she created, rather than being mere tools, were given a degree of autonomy and consciousness, becoming themselves contributors to the work of healing and restoration. Nephera worked with Synthesis to develop new forms of cosmic monitoring systems, ways of perceiving the health and status of the multiverse as a whole. These systems allowed for early detection of problems before they could become crises, permitting preventative action rather than reactive solutions. Solaria established communication networks with the consciousnesses of stars throughout the multiverse. She created what amounted to an interdimensional library of stellar knowledge, a vast repository of information that had been accumulated by the ancient minds of stars over billions of years. Miralith developed techniques for adapting the living creatures of one universe to survive in the different physical conditions of other universes, should they choose to migrate or explore. This work, combined with Topo's bridges and Dispo's communication networks, created the potential for unprecedented exchange of genetic and cultural material between universes. Frost and Kaba expanded their diplomatic efforts to include formal treaty making. They established what became known as the Multiverse Accords, a set of agreements that laid out the principles by which different universes would interact with each other. The obligations they had to support each other, and the boundaries that would be respected to maintain independence. And at the center of it all, Synthesis sat in the central chamber of the palace. Maintaining awareness of everything that was happening, keeping track of the delicate balance that had been established, and ensuring that growth continued without ding into the chaos that would result if any single force became too dominant. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. The Paradox of Power. But as months turned into years, and the new generation of GS born to the Council of Ascension began to mature, a new kind of problem began to emerge. This problem was not external in nature, not a threat from outside the multiverse. Rather, it was a problem that arose from the very success of the system that Goku, now Synthesis, had created. The problem was this: the more successful the multiverse became, the more flourishing and growth that occurred, more power accumulated in the hands of the Council of Ascension and their children. And while Synthesis maintained perfect balance within himself, while he demonstrated through his own existence at overwhelming power did not necessarily lead to tyranny or oppression, there was no guarantee that this would always be the case. What would happen if Synthesis's balance was ever disrupted? What would happen if one member of the Council of Ascension decided to pursue their own agenda, using their power to enforce their vision upon the multiverse? What would happen if the new generation, inheriting the vast power of their parents, decided to use that power for purposes that the Council had not approved? These were the questions that began to haunt Celestia, the daughter of Goku and the Triad Unity. Unlike her father, who had always possessed an almost blind faith in the goodness of those around him, who had always believed that growth and transcendence would naturally lead to ethical behavior, Celestia had inherited from her mother a more cautious pragmatism, a recognition that power without accountability was always a potential threat. She brought her concerns to Synthesis one evening, and their conversation took place not in the physical central chamber, but rather in a space that existed entirely within consciousness, a realm where two minds could meet and communicate with perfect clarity. "We need checks on power," Celestia said without preamble. "We need systems of accountability. We need ways to ensure that even if you were to fall, even if your balance was disrupted, the multiverse would not collapse back into tyranny or chaos." "What do you propose?" Synthesis asked, and his voice carried no defensiveness, only genuine curiosity. "I propose the creation of a council of balance," Celestia replied. "Not to rule alongside you or against you, but to watch, to monitor, to serve as a counterbalance to your power. This council would be composed not of the most powerful beings, but of those who understand power most deeply precisely because they have chosen to limit their own." "You want to create a council of the weak to constrain the strong?" Synthesis asked, and there was something almost like amusement in his voice. "I want to create a council of the wise," Celestia corrected. "I want beings who understand that true power lies in restraint, in knowing what not to do with one's abilities, in choosing limitation for the sake of balance. I want beings who can perceive the temptations that come with power and have chosen to resist them." Synthesis considered this carefully. The concept was not entirely new, as the Omni King had attempted something similar in the establishment of the gods of destruction. But the Omni King had relied on fear and D. The threat of erasure to maintain discipline. Celestia was proposing something more subtle and potentially more effective, a reliance on wisdom and understanding rather than on threat and coercion. Who would compose this council of balance? Synthesis asked. That is where the proposal becomes more complex, Celestia admitted. The council would need to include beings from outside the current power structure. It would need to include representatives from the civilizations and species that live throughout the multiverse. It would need to be democratic in nature, with the council members being chosen by popular vote rather than by appointment or inheritance. That is a significant change from the current system, Synthesis observed. It is, Celestia agreed. But it is necessary. The current system, while more enlightened than the Omni King's regime, is still ultimately based on the benevolence of those with power. And while your benevolence is beyond question, and while the benevolence of the council members seems secure, there is no guarantee that this will always be the case. Eventually, there will be a leader who is not as wise, who is not as committed to principles of growth and elevation. When that leader comes, the multiverse needs to have safeguards in place. Synthesis reached across the boundaries of consciousness and touched his daughter's mind directly, reading not just her words but her thoughts. Her understanding of what she was proposing and why. You have thought about this carefully, he said finally. You have perceived possibilities and probabilities that I, in my current state of cosmic awareness, have perhaps been too distant to perceive clearly. I believe you were right. The Council of Balance should be created. But even as Synthesis agreed with Celestia's proposal, he was aware that implementing it would not be simple. The members of the Council of Ascension, while generally wise and good-intentioned, had grown accustomed to their position of ultimate authority. Introducing a Council of Balance that could question their decisions, that could investigate their actions, that could theoretically overrule them if a majority deemed it necessary, would be a significant blow to their power and influence. The announcement of the creation of the Council of Balance came 3 weeks later, during a gathering of all the major powers in the multiverse. Synthesis called a convocation, a meeting that had not occurred since the Tournament of Power, a gathering where representatives from all 8 universes could come together to discuss matters of cosmic significance. The response was mixed. Some members of the Council of Ascension recognized immediately the wisdom of the proposal and supported it enthusiastically. Jiren, in particular, seemed to understand that true strength lay in the acceptance of limitations, in the willingness to be accountable to others. A sovereign who cannot be questioned is a tyrant, no matter their intentions. Jiren said during the convocation, I support the creation of the Council of Balance. I believe we should go further. I propose that the Council of Balance have the power to remove any member of the Council of Ascension from their position if that member is deemed to be acting contrary to the principles of growth and elevation. This proposal was radical in its implications, and it sparked intense debate among the assembled powers. Hit supported it, understanding from his centuries of experience as an assassin how even good people could be corrupted by power. Toppo was initially hesitant, but ultimately agreed, recognizing that the proposal did not threaten his work as the architect, merely created oversight to ensure he did not use his architectural power for purposes that conflicted with the broader principles of the multiverse. But it was Dispo who provided the most eloquent argument in favor of the proposal. The speedster spoke of the millions of civilizations and billions of beings throughout the multiverse who had never been given a voice in the decisions that affected their lives. He spoke of the responsibility that came with power, and how that responsibility could only be truly fulfilled if there was accountability to those who would be affected by the use of that power. A government without the consent of the governed is tyranny, Dispo declared, and his words seemed to resonate across the entire multiverse. Even a benevolent tyranny is still tyranny. If we truly believe in the principles of growth and elevation, if we truly believe that all beings have the potential to achieve their own greatness, then we must extend to them the opportunity to shape the systems that govern their own existence. The vote was not unanimous, but it was overwhelming. 8 out of 10 members of the Council of Ascension voted in favor of the creation of the Council of Balance with expanded powers. Only Luminara and one of the younger council members abstained, neither voting yes nor no. When Synthesis asked them why they had abstained, Luminara gave an answer that was both philosophical and troubling. I abstain because I believe that power without the ability to act unilaterally is not truly power, she said. I believe there will come moments where the right action will be contrary to the will of the majority, moments where a sovereign must act against the wishes of those they govern for the sake of greater good. If we restrict the power of leaders too completely, if we make it so that they cannot act without the approval of a council, then we risk paralyzing the multiverse at the precise moment when swift, unilateral action is most necessary. You may be right, Synthesis replied, and there was sadness in his voice. But the risk of absolute power corrupting absolutely is greater than the risk of necessary action being delayed. We will proceed with the creation of the Council of Balance. The establishment of the Council of Balance took several months to complete. Elections were held throughout all 8 universes, with the primary criteria for candidacy being not power or position, but rather wisdom, understanding, and a demonstrated commitment to the principles of growth and elevation. The elected representatives came from all walks of life and from all species and civilizations. There was a humble agricultural worker Fr. Ohm Universe 7 whose understanding of the cycles of growth and decay had led to revolutionary agricultural practices. There was an ancient scholar from Universe 1 whose studies of history had provided deep insights into how civilizations rose and fell based on the degree to which they valued growth over stagnation. There was a young engineer from Universe 3 whose innovations in sustainable energy had transformed the economy of their entire civilization. And most surprisingly, there was a representative elected from Universe 4, Ravenna herself. Despite having rejected inclusion in the Council of Ascension, Ravenna understood the value of the Council of Balance. She recognized that it represented a way to ensure that no single group, not even the Council of Ascension, could impose their vision of growth upon those who preferred isolation or independence. When Ravenna took her seat on the newly formed Council of Balance, something significant shifted in the consciousness of the multiverse. It was a recognition that even those who disagreed with the dominant system, even those who stood apart from the mainstream, had a role to play in ensuring that the system remained fair and equitable. The first task of the Council of Balance was to establish protocols for how they would monitor and investigate the actions of the Council of Ascension. These protocols needed to be rigorous enough to detect corruption or abuse of power, but not so burdensome as to prevent the Council of Ascension from functioning effectively. The work of establishing these protocols took months, but when it was complete, something extraordinary had been created. A system of governance that incorporated both the necessity of strong, enlightened leadership and the necessity of accountability and democratic participation. It was neither purely authoritarian nor purely democratic, but rather a synthesis of both approaches. Years passed under this new system. The multiverse continued to flourish and grow. The new generation of beings born to the Council of Ascension matured and began to take on their own roles in the governance of existence. Celestia, in particular, proved to be an extraordinary leader, eventually taking on the formal role of mediator between the Council of Ascension and the Council of Balance, ensuring that the two bodies worked together toward common goals rather than becoming locked in conflict. But it was during the 15th year after the formation of the Council of Balance that something unexpected happened. Something that revealed a flaw in the system that no one had anticipated. A problem that would require not just wisdom or power, but a fundamental rethinking of what governance could be. The problem began when the Council of Balance received a petition from a being who had been living in isolation on a small asteroid in Universe 2. The being had discovered something in their meditations that they felt obligated to report. A member of the Council of Ascension had been secretly diverting resources, accumulating power, and preparing for something that looked disturbingly like a coup. The identity of the being in question shocked everyone. It was Frost, the pragmatic diplomat and bridge builder who had seemed most committed to principles of balance and cooperation. When confronted with the allegation, Frost did not deny it. Instead, He explained his reasoning with a clarity and logical precision that left little doubt of his sincerity. The system is unsustainable, Frost said to the assembled Council of Ascension and Council of Balance. I have observed trends developing across the multiverse that suggest that democracy, as beautiful a concept as it is, will eventually lead to stagnation. The masses, given the opportunity to vote on all decisions, will consistently choose safety and stability over growth and transcendence. Eventually, the multiverse will regress to a state of stagnation that is only marginally better than the Omni King's regime. And so you decided to circumvent the democratic process? Kaba asked, his voice filled with disappointment and sadness. You decided that you knew better than everyone else, and that you should prepare to impose your vision by force. Yes, Frost replied without hesitation. Because I believe that some decisions cannot be left to the whims of the masses. I believe someone needs to be willing to act unilaterally, to impose difficult decisions even when those decisions will be unpopular, because those decisions are necessary for long-term flourishing. The situation created a crisis unlike anything that the multiverse had faced since the integration of the unbinder. On one level, Frost was right. There were risks to democratic governance, risks that majority rule could lead to decisions that harmed long-term growth. But on another level, Frost's actions violated the fundamental principles of the system that had been painstakingly constructed. The Council of Balance moved to remove Frost from his position, invoking the expanded powers that Jiren had proposed years ago. But Frost resisted, using his considerable power and cunning to prevent the Council of Balance from enforcing their decision. The multiverse found itself on the edge of civil war, with some beings supporting Frost's argument that benevolent autocracy was sometimes necessary, while others defended the principle of democratic accountability and the rule of law. It was Synthesis who ultimately resolved the crisis, though not in the way anyone expected. Rather than using his cosmic power to force a resolution, Synthesis appeared to Frost in person, walking in his human form through the palace where Frost had barricaded himself with his supporters. When Synthesis arrived, Frost was standing with his followers, his power fully manifest, ready for conflict. Synthesis, by contrast, appeared almost vulnerable, without obvious power, manifesting in a form that could be physically harmed. You have always been one of the most intelligent beings in the multiverse, Synthesis said to Frost. You have always understood strategy and consequence better than almost anyone. I ask you, what is the endgame of your resistance? What is the ultimate outcome you are seeking? The preservation of growth, Frost replied. The prevention of stagnation through the imposition of necessary change. And how many beings will be harmed in the process of imposing that change? Synthesis asked. How many civilizations will be disrupted? How many deaths will result from the conference? That will occur if you insist on moving forward with your plans. Frost was silent for a long moment, and it was clear that he had been asking himself the same questions. I do not know, he said finally. But I believe the long-term benefit outweighs the short-term harm. That is the thinking of a tyrant, Synthesis replied, and his voice carried no judgment, only sadness. That is the logic by which every atrocity has been committed. The actor always believes that their vision of the future justifies the harm done in the present to achieve it. But I have learned something through my transformation. Something that I should have understood earlier. True growth cannot be imposed. True transcendence cannot be forced. If a being or a civilization chooses stagnation, then we must honor that choice. Even if we believe it is a mistake. Even if that mistake leads to the eventual collapse of the entire multiverse. Frost asked. Even then, Synthesis replied. Because the alternative, the imposition of growth through power and coercion, leads to a different kind of collapse, a spiritual and moral collapse that is far more destructive than mere stagnation. As Synthesis spoke these words, something shifted in Frost's understanding. The pragmatic diplomat, who had always been willing to do what was necessary to achieve his goals, suddenly perceived a larger perspective. He saw how his attempt to preserve growth through coercion would inevitably lead to the same kind of rigid authoritarianism that the Omni-King had established. Without a word, Frost lowered his power, surrendering to the Council of Balance. He accepted their judgment and was removed from his position on the Council of Ascension. But Synthesis ensured that he was not punished or imprisoned. Instead, Frost was given the opportunity to work with the Council of Balance, to help develop better systems for detecting and preventing the kind of thinking that had led him down the path to attempted coup. The resolution of the Frost Rebellion, as it came to be known, taught the entire multiverse an important lesson, that even the best systems, even the most carefully constructed governance, could be raided by those who believed they were acting in service to growth and transcendence. The challenge was not to create a perfect system, but rather to create a system that could adapt and evolve when faced with challenges. A system that could learn from its mistakes. End of Chapter 12. Chapter 13. The Eternal Challenge. 20 years after the Frost Rebellion, the multiverse had settled in to a period of stable flourishing that seemed almost dreamlike in its perfection. The Council of Ascension and the Council of Balance worked together with remarkable harmony, each checking and supporting the other. The new generation of beings born to the original council members had grown into their power, taking on leadership roles throughout the 8 universes. Celestia had proven to be not just a capable mediator, but an innovative thinker who brought perspectives that neither the Council of Ascension nor the Council of Balance had fully considered. She worked on problems that transcend the boundaries of individual universes, issues that required coordination between all 8 to resolve. One such issue was the phenomenon of probability distortion, a gradual tendency for certain probability branches to accumulate more reality weight than others, leading to an imbalance in the fundamental structure of existence. The more one timeline manifested, the less likely alternative timelines became, until eventually all possibilities seemed to collapse into a single path. Celestia recognized that this was a natural consequence of the multiverse's structure, but one that could be actively managed. Working with Chronesia and the members of the Temporal Academy, she developed techniques for periodically resetting probability weights, ensuring that no single timeline became so dominant, and that other possibilities were entirely crushed. This work, while not dramatic, was crucial for maintaining the long-term health of the multiverse. It represented a shift from the focus on dramatic power and visible transformation that had characterized the earlier periods to a focus on subtle but essential maintenance and balance. But even as this work proceeded, there was a growing awareness among the cosmic powers that something had begun to shift. The Omni King, who had remained distant and uninvolved since stepping back from direct rule, began to send increasingly frequent communications through Chronesia. The multiverse is becoming too stable, the Omni King said during one of these communications, speaking through Chronesia to Synthesis and the assembled council. This stability is not natural. It is not sustainable. You are attempting to freeze existence in a state of perfection, but freezing is not living. The multiverse requires chaos, requires conflict, requires the possibility of failure and loss. Are you saying that our efforts to create a system of governance that prevents suffering and maximizes growth are counterproductive? Synthesis asked, and there was concern in his voice. I am saying that you have created a system so carefully balanced that nothing new can emerge, the Omni King replied. Every action is monitored, every decision is checked by a counter-decision. Every potential change is smoothed out by the mechanisms you have put in place. The multiverse is stagnating, not because beings choose stagnation, but because the system itself prevents the kind of radical growth that comes from genuine risk and genuine failure. What do you propose? Celestia asked, her mind already racing through the implications of what the Omni King was saying. I propose that you allow chaos. The Omni King replied, I propose that you loosen your control, that you permit beings to make mistakes, that you allow the consequences of poor decisions to unfold without interference. Growth without the possibility of failure is not true growth, it is mere simulation. This message caused profound debate among the councils. Some members argued that the Omni King was right, that they had become too focused on preventing suffering that they had forgotten that suffering often preceded growth. Others argued that the Omni King was testing them, attempting to manipulate them into dismantling the systems that kept order in the multiverse. It was Ravenna who broke the impasse by proposing a radical solution. Create an experimental universe, she said to the assembled councils. A universe where the normal rules do not apply, where beings are free to make mistakes without the oversight of the councils, where growth comes not from guidance but from uncontrolled trial and error. That would be extraordinarily dangerous, Jiren objected. Such a universe would likely descend into chaos and suffering at a level that our normal universes would find incomprehensible. Yes, Ravenna agreed, but it would also be a testing ground, a place where truly new forms of existence might emerge, where growth beyond what we have imagined might occur. And if the experiment failed, if the universe did descend into uncontrollable chaos, the councils would still have the option to intervene, to reset it or to contain the chaos before it spread to the other universes. The proposal was radical, but after extensive debate, it was approved. A ninth universe was created, designated as the experimental universe, Universe 0. This universe was intentionally left with minimal oversight. With no presence from the Council of Ascension, with only the bare minimum of guidance from synthesis necessary to prevent it from completely collapsing. What happy Ned in Universe Zero over the next several years was exactly as troubling and fascinating as everyone had predicted. The universe became a place of extraordinary conflict and suffering, where beings struggled against each other with no external force to restrain them, where growth often came at the cost of tremendous pain and loss. But it was also a place of unprecedented creativity, where beings who had never experienced the guidance of the Council of Ascension developed entirely new forms of power, entirely new ways of thinking about existence and consciousness. Some of these beings would eventually become some of the most powerful and wise beings in the entire multiverse, having been forged in the crucible of struggle rather than groomed by careful guidance. More importantly, the tense of Universe Zero seemed to shift something in the consciousness of the other 8 universes. It was as if the permission to have chaos exist somewhere, even if only in a carefully contained form, allowed beings throughout the multiverse to accept the imperfections and difficulties of their own existence without the constant expectation that every problem should be smoothly resolved by the councils. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. The multiverse evolved and grew in ways that none of the original councils could have predicted. New species emerged, new forms of consciousness arose, new types of power that transcended anything that had been conceived of before began to manifest. And through it all, synthesis remained at the center, maintaining the balance that had been established. But always remaining open to change, always willing to adapt and evolve as the multiverse itself transformed. But there came a moment, 1,000 years after Goku had first transformed into synthesis, when even the cosmic sovereign began to feel the weight of eternity pressing down. The endless task of maintaining balance, of managing the multiverse, of preventing the emergence of any single force becoming too dominant, began to feel less like a mission and more like a burden. It was the Triad Unity who first noticed the change in synthesis. She had remained at his side throughout all the centuries, her consciousness still intimately connected to his, even as he had grown into something vaster and more cosmic. "You are tired," she said to him one evening as they sat together in the private chambers of the palace. A space that had barely changed since the early days of his rule despite the fundamental transformations that had occurred in the multiverse. "Not tired," Synthesis replied, "but perhaps beginning to understand the burden that the Omni King bore for all the ages. The weight of caring for an entire multiverse, the responsibility of ensuring that growth continues without collapse into chaos. The awareness that one mistake, one moment of insufficient attention, could lead to catastrophe." "What are you saying?" the Triad Unity asked, and there was fear in her voice. A fear that her eternal partner might be considering stepping away, might be preparing to hand the burden to someone else. "I am saying that I believe the time has come for the next transformation," Synthesis replied. "Not a transformation of my own consciousness, but a transformation of how the multiverse is governed. I believe that Celestia is ready. I believe that the new generation is ready. I believe that they should take on greater responsibility for the governance of the multiverse, and that I should begin to step back." "Are you saying that you would leave the multiverse?" the Triad Unity asked, her voice trembling slightly. "No," Synthesis replied, "I would not leave, but I would diminish my direct involvement. I would become more of an advisor, a teacher, a presence that could be called upon in times of crisis, but not the central authority that oversees all governance. The multiverse has grown beyond the point where it requires such centralized control." Over the next several years, Synthesis worked with Celestia and the councils to establish new systems of governance that would distribute power and responsibility even more widely than had been done before. Celestia formally took on the role of Cosmic Sovereign, a title that was less about individual authority and more about responsibility for coordination and communication across the 8 universes. The councils themselves were reformed and expanded, bringing in new members from the populations of the universes, from beings who had proven their wisdom and dedication to the principles of growth and de-elevation through their actions rather than through their power levels. Slowly but surely, Synthesis began to withdraw from the active governance of the multiverse, not out of abandonment, but wrath. As an act of faith that the systems and the beings he had helped create were capable of continuing without his constant oversight. And as he withdrew, something interesting began to happen. With the presence of Synthesis as the ultimate authority, the members of the expanded councils began to develop more confidence in their own judgment. Without the guarantee that mistakes could be corrected by cosmic powers far beyond their own, beings throughout the multiverse began to take their responsibilities more seriously. The multiverse did not descend into chaos. Rather, it flourished in new ways, developing in directions that synthesis had never anticipated and could never have fully predicted. New forms of beauty emerged, new ways of understanding consciousness and power, new approaches to solving the fundamental problems of existence. 1,000 years of cosmic rule had taught synthesis an important lesson. The greatest power was not the power to control, but the power to inspire and empower others to take control of their own destinies. And as he stepped back from his role, as he allowed others to take up the burden of governance, he understood that this was the true legacy he was leaving behind. Not a perfect system, not an eternal stability, but rather a framework within which growth and transcendence could continue indefinitely. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14. The Legacy of Growth. The transition of power from synthesis to Celestia and the expanded councils was not instantaneous, but rather unfolded over decades, each step carefully planned and executed to ensure stability and continuity. Synthesis did not simply vanish from the equation, but rather remained available as a source of wisdom and counsel, appearing when major decisions needed to be made, of faring perspective when conflicts threatened to escalate beyond what the councils could manage. But increasingly, his counsel became unnecessary. Celestia proved to be more than capable of leading, not through the force of her power, but through the depth of her understanding and the genuine care she showed for all beings under her care. She had inherited the best traits of both her parents, the tireless pursuit of growth and transcendence from Goku, and the thoughtful pragmatism and multifaceted wisdom from the Triad Unity. The Triad Unity herself underwent a transformation during this period. Rather than remaining in the background as synthesis's eternal companion, she emerged as a leading voice on the Council of Balance, working to ensure that the powers of the Sovereign and the Conch remained truly balanced and accountable. She traveled throughout the 8 universes, meeting with common beings, with the species and civilizations that formed the foundation of the multiverse's structure. She listened to their concerns, their fears, their hopes for the future. And she brought their voices back to the councils, ensuring that even as decision-making power was being distributed among more and more beings, the needs and desires of ordinary people were never forgotten. The children of the original council members had grown into their full power and maturity. Celestia's siblings and cousins all took on significant roles in the governance of the multiverse. Some chose to follow paths similar to those of their parents, specializing in specific aspects of cosmic administration. Others forged entirely new paths, developing new understanding of power and governance that transcended anything their parents had imagined. But perhaps the most important development was the emergence of entirely new generations of beings throughout the multiverse who had not been created through the merging of cosmic powers, but rather had emerged naturally from the civilizations and species that populated the 8 universes. These beings, lacking the cosmic parentage of the council's children, possessed something that was perhaps even more valuable, the understanding that came from rising to power through personal effort and dedication rather than through inheritance. They brought perspectives to the councils that were informed by the lived experience of ordinary life, by the challenges faced by those without cosmic power, by the real-world consequences of the decisions made at the highest levels of governance. In Universe 1, a being named Verithas, who had risen from BLE origins to become a master of probability and causality, joined the expanded council and brought with him an understanding of mathematics and logic that had never been fully incorporated into cosmic governance before. His work in establishing better systems for predicting the consequences of different courses of action revolutionized how decisions were made. In Universe 2, a young warrior Salyuth emerged as a master of the integration of different types of power, developing techniques for combining the strengths of different beings without forcing them into uncomfortable fusion states. Her work inspired new forms of cooperation and collaboration throughout the multiverse. In Universe 3, an artist named Resonate created forms of beauty that transcended the physical forms of pure aesthetic expression that somehow carried within them deep truths about the nature of consciousness and existence. Her work influenced how the councils thought about the purpose of governance. Not just to maximize growth and minimize suffering, but to create the conditions in which beauty and meaning could flourish. In Universe 4, Ravenna's own child had grown into a leader of remarkable wisdom. One who understood both the value of connection and the necessity of independence better than perhaps any being in the multiverse. This being became a bridge between Ravenna's philosophy of isolation and Synthesis's philosophy of unified growth, proving that both could coexist in a mature cosmic civilization. In Universe 5, a collective consciousness composed of millions of ALS of the same species merged their awareness to create a single being capable of holding contradictory thoughts simultaneously. This being, called Paradox, brought to the councils an understanding that truth itself could be multifaceted. That what appeared to be contradictions at one level of analysis could be harmonies at a different level. In Universe 6, Universe 7, and Universe 8, similar beings emerged. Each bringing unique perspectives, each contributing to the development of a more sophisticated and nuanced understanding of how the multiverse could be governed. 5,000 years after Goku had first transformed into Synthesis, a major historical event occurred. Synthesis formally abdicated his position as sovereign of the multiverse. This was not a surprise to the cosmic community, as Synthesis had been gradually reducing his direct involvement for centuries. But the formal abdication was significant, as it marked the end of an era and the beginning of something entirely new. In a ceremony that was witnessed by beings from all 8 universes, including representatives from the most distant and isolated civilizations, Synthesis transferred his power and authority to Celestia and to the expanded councils collectively. He did not relinquish his cosmic might, which would have been impossible to do. Rather, he placed that power at the service of the councils, making clear that he would no longer initiate action on his own authority, but would only act when directed to do so by the formal vote of the councils. "I have done what I set out to do," Synthesis said in his abdication speech, his voice carrying across the multiverse. "I have helped to establish a system of governance that values growth, that respects the autonomy of individuals and civilizations, that incorporates both the necessity of strong leadership and the necessity of accountability and democratic participation. But the system I helped create is no longer one that requires my constant oversight. In fact, my presence has become somewhat of an obstacle to the further development of the multiverse, for as long as a being of my power remains in a position of ultimate authority, the aspirations and ambitions of other beings will inevitably be limited by the awareness that they are not truly supreme. Therefore, I am stepping down. I am placing my power at the service of the councils and the multiverse as a whole. I am reducing my presence to that of an advisor and a teacher, available when asked but not determining the course of events. I am demonstrating through my own ascension that true strength lies not in holding on to power, but in the willingness to release it, to trust that others can wield it wisely, to believe that the universe and those who inhabit it are capable of continued growth even without my constant guidance." When Synthesis finished speaking, he walked down from the platform where he had delivered his address and moved to stand beside the Triad Unity, taking on a position that was equal rather than supreme, no longer the central authority but rather one voice among many. The effect of this moment rippled through the consciousness of the entire multiverse. In that single gesture, Synthesis had demonstrated something far more powerful than any display of force ever could. He had shown that letting go was not weakness but ultimate strength. That empowerment of others was the highest form of power. Inspired by this example, other cosmic beings throughout the multiverse began to examine their own relationship to power and authority. Some chose to step back from their positions. Others remained in their roles but began to exercise their power with greater restraint, more awareness of their responsibility to others. Still others began to develop new structures and systems to ensure that power was never concentrated in too few hands. The centuries that followed were marked by a kind of flourishing that had not been seen since the first days of Synthesis's rule, when everything was new and the multiverse was full of possibility. But this new flourishing was different, because it was not directed from above but rather arose organically from the choices and decisions of beings throughout the multiverse who had been empowered to shape their own destinies. In Universe 0, the experimental universe, a remarkable development occurred. After 10,000 years of unguided existence, the beings that had evolved there had developed a civilization that had neither the structure of the original 8 universes nor the chaos that had initially characterized the universe. Rather, they had created something entirely new, a form of social organization that seemed to combine the strengths of various approaches while minimizing the weaknesses. When representatives from Universe Zero first made contact with the Council of Ascension, they brought with them ideas that revolutionized how the other universes thought about governance and social organization. It seemed that having been forced to develop entirely on their own, without the guidance of cosmic powers, the beings of Universe Zero had discovered truths that the other universes had missed. Had found solutions to ancient problems that no amount of cosmic wisdom could have revealed. This development had profound implications. It suggested that the Omni Kings predict Ion had been correct. That the multiverse did indeed require chaos, required the possibility of failure and the necessity of independent development to achieve its full potential. The existence of Universe Zero served as evidence that different approaches, even dramatically different approaches, could all contribute to the overall growth and evolution of the multiverse. 10,000 years after Goku's transformation into Synthesis, the being known as Synthesis chose to undergo a final transformation. This transformation was not dramatic or visible in the way that his earlier transformation had been. Rather, it was a gradual merging of his consciousness with the fabric of the multiverse itself. Synthesis did not disappear. Rather, he became distributed throughout existence, his consciousness becoming a kind of background hum. A gentle presence that could be felt by those who were sufficiently attuned to perceive it. He became, in essence, a principle rather than an individual being. A law of nature that embodied the values of growth and connection without imposing those values through force or direct governance. The Triad Unity, confronted with her eternal partner's final transformation, chose a different path. Rather than merging with the multiverse, she chose to remain in individual form, to continue to advocate for the values that she and Goku had always held dear. She became the eternal mediator, a permanent representative of the voice of compassion and connection within the councils, ensuring that as the multiverse continued to evolve, the human element, the element of emotional connection and deep relationship, was never forgotten or marginalized. Together, in their final configuration, Synthesis is a distributed principle and the Triad Unity as an eternal voice. They represented the balance that had proven to be the key to the multiverse's flourishing. Power without compassion, strength without connection, would lead to tyranny. But compassion without power, connection without the ability to enforce it against those who would violate it, would lead to helplessness. Only the combination of both, in perfect equilibrium, could create the conditions for true growth. End of Chapter 14. Chapter 15. Eternity's Reflection. 20,000 years after the end of the Omni King's direct rule, 10,000 years after Synthesis's transformation into a distributed principle. The 8 universes had evolved far beyond anything that Goku could have imagined in those early days when he had first accepted the role of sovereign. The Council of Ascension still existed, though it bore little resemblance to its original form. The beings who had founded it had long since passed into legend and myth, though many still served on the council in evolved forms. Their consciousnesses preserved and maintained through technologies and spiritual practices that had been developed over the ages. Jiren, the gray warrior who had once pursued strength in isolation, had evolved into something that transcended individual consciousness altogether. His meditation practice had become so refined over the millennia that his mind had essentially become a kind of cosmic archive. A repository for all the knowledge and wisdom that had been accumulated throughout the multiverse's history. Hit, the legendary assassin who had become a teacher of temporal mechanics, D eventually transcended time altogether, achieving a state of consciousness that existed simultaneously in all moments of past, present, and future. He was no longer bound by the linear flow of causality, but rather could perceive and influence events across the entirety of the multiverse's timeline. Toppo, the creator, had spent the millennia constructing not just physical structures but conceptual ones, building the frameworks through which new forms of consciousness could emerge and develop. His architectures had become so sophisticated that some of them had achieved a degree of sentience themselves, becoming collaborators in the ongoing work of cosmic design. But alongside these ancient beings, new leaders had emerged. Celestia, who had taken on the role of sovereign in Synthesis's place, had herself transformed into something remarkable. Having dedicated her existence to understanding and facilitating growth in others, she had eventually become a kind of living school, a being whose mere presence caused those around her to reach toward their own potential. The children of the original council members had long since become the old guard themselves, and their children had become leaders. And their children's children had begun to develop power and understanding that rivaled that of the original generation. This lineage of leadership, passing from generation to generation, ensured that the values established in the early days of synthesis's rule were transmitted forward in living form rather than as mere doctrine or law. But perhaps the most significant development as the emergence of what was called the Great Conversation. This was not a single conversation, but rather an ongoing dialogue that involved being from every civilization, species, and level of power throughout the multiverse. The purpose of the Great Conversation was to collectively determine the direction in which the multiverse should grow, to decide together what values should guide civilization. To ensure that even as cosmic powers made the final decisions about governance, those decisions reflected the true desires and wisdom of all beings, not just the powerful few. The Great Conversation took place not in a single location, but simultaneously in all 8 universes, in countless forums and gatherings and dialogues, all connected through the vast network of consciousness that Synthesis had established in the early days of his rule. No decision made by the councils was final until it had been submitted to the Great Conversation for approval or modification. This process was often slow and sometimes frustrating, leading to much debate and disagreement. But it had proven to be effective in a way that no system of purely centralized governance could ever be. Because every being, no matter how humble or insignificant their power level, had a voice in the process, the decisions that emerged from the Great Conversation carried with them a kind of moral authority that transcended mere law or coercion. It was in the context of the Great Conversation that a revolutionary proposal emerged, one that would have been unthinkable in the early days of Synthesis's rule. A being from Universe 5, a descendant of Paradox, proposed that the entire system of cosmic governance be fundamentally reconsidered. "We have built a beautiful system," the being, who went by the name Reverence, said in a submission to the Great Conversation. "We have created the conditions under which growth and transcendence are possible, in which beings are empowered to shape their own destinies. But in the process, we have created something new, a structure of power, even if that power is distributed and accountable, that inevitably limits what is possible. I propose that we consider moving beyond governance altogether. I propose that instead of having councils, instead of having structures and hierarchies through which power is exercised and channeled, we experiment with complete decentralization. Let each civilization, each community, each individual being, develop according to its own understanding of what is right and good. Let us have a period of radical independence, where the multiverse is divided not by cosmic law but by simple boundaries, where each domain develops according to its own logic. This is dangerous," Reverence acknowledged. "It will lead to conflict in some cases, to suffering in others. But it will also lead to extraordinary creativity, to the emergence of entirely new forms of being that our current systems would never permit." The proposal sparked intense debate throughout the Great Conversation. Some beings were horrified by the suggestion, recognizing that the removal of cosmic governance would inevitably lead to the rise of local tyrannies, to the exploitation of the weak by the strong, to suffering on a scale that the protected multiverse had not experienced in many millennia. But others were intrigued, recognizing that perhaps Reverence was pointing toward a necessary next step in the multiverse's evolution. Perhaps, they argued, the multiverse had reached a point of maturity where it no longer required the guidance and protection of cosmic powers. Perhaps the greatest growth would come from allowing beings to develop entirely independently, from permitting failure and pain and struggle to occur without cosmic intervention. T was the triad unity who offered a compromise solution, a proposal that incorporated the wisdom of both perspectives. "Let us create what might be called the free zones," she said in a statement submitted to the Great Conversation. "Regions within each universe where governance is minimal, where beings are free to develop according to their own choices, where cosmic law does not extend. These zones would be bounded, contained within specific regions, so that if they descended into chaos or suffering, that chaos would not spread to affect the rest of the multiverse. Beings would be free to relocate to the free zones if they wished to experience life without cosmic governance. And if the experiment proved successful, if the free zones developed in ways that were as beautiful and creative as we hoped, then gradually, carefully, we could expand the zones, allowing more of the multiverse to develop in radical independence." This proposal was accepted by the Great Conversation, though not unanimously. The free zones were established in each of the 8 universes, and beings began to move into them. Some did so out of a desire for radical freedom. Others were driven by curiosity, by a need to understand whether life could flourish without the supporting structure of cosmic governance. What happened in the free zones over the next 1,000 years was, predictably, a mixture of tragedy and beauty, failure and success, suffering and transcendent achievement. Some free zones descended into chaos, as had been feared, leading to the implementation of containment protocols to prevent the chaos from spreading. But others flourished, developing entirely new forms of social organization and artistic and technological expression. Most importantly, the free zones provided invaluable information about what was truly necessary for civilization to function, and what was merely convenient or comforting but not essential. This information allowed the councils to refine their approach to governance throughout the rest of the multiverse, to distinguish between interference that was truly necessary to prevent harm and interference that merely reflected the preferences of those in power. As the free zones expanded and the multiverse continued to evolve, Goku, in his distributed form as synthesis, watched and learned. Though he no longer took direct action, though he had renounced his role as a cosmic ruler, he remained aware, remained engaged with the development of the universe in a way that transcended conventional governance. And the triad unity, forever young, forever vigilant, forever committed to the values of growth and connection and compassion, continued her work as the eternal advocate for the elements of existence that could not be reduced to systems of law or governance: emotion, intuition, artistic expression, the capacity for genuine connection between beings. Together, in their final forms, they represented the ultimate statement about what Goku's transformation from simple Saiyan warrior to cosmic sovereign had ultimately meant. It was not about the accumulation of power or the exercise of control. It was about the acceptance of responsibility that came with power, the willingness to use that power in service of the growth and elevation of others, and the eventual wisdom to step back, to diminish oneself, to allow others to take on the burdens and joys of continued development. The story of Goku's ascension to cosmic dominion was not an ending, but rather a beginning, a threshold through which the entire multiverse had passed, a transformation that had set the stage for all that would follow. And as the ages continued to pass, as the multiverse evolved in ways both predicted and unforeseen, the principles that Goku had embodied, growth, transcendence, connection, the willingness to elevate others, remained at the very heart of all that the multiverse was becoming. End of Chapter 15. Epilogue. The Eternal Return. 1 million years after Goku's transformation into synthesis, an event occurred that seemed to close a circle, though in truth it was not a closing but rather a new beginning disguised as a homecoming. A being appeared at the borders of Universe 7. A being who had not been seen by anyone in the multiverse for longer than the memory of most civilizations stretched. This being was neither young nor old, neither weak nor supremely powerful, but rather existed in a state that transcended such classifications. It was the Omni King. The Omni King had not been entirely absent from the multiverse all these ages. The being who had once ruled all of existence had been observing from beyond the boundaries of conventional reality, watching how the system that Goku and his allies had created had evolved and transformed. Now the Omni King had returned, not to reclaim power, not to reverse the changes that had been made, but rather to deliver a message, a statement of judgment upon the experiment that had been conducted across the millennia. When Goku's consciousness, distributed though it was throughout the multiverse, recognized the Omni King's presence, it stirred to full awareness. For the first time in centuries, synthesis pulled itself together into something approaching individual form, meeting the Omni King not as a subject meeting a ruler, but as an equal meeting an equal. "I have come to tell you that you were right," the Omni King said. And in these words, there was something that might have been approval, might have been admiration, might have been something even beyond these conventional categories. "The multiverse that has developed under your guidance is more beautiful, more complex, more genuinely alive than it ever was under my direct rule. I ruled the multiverse with perfection," the Omni King continued. "I saw all things clearly, understood all consequences, prevented all suffering through the exercise of absolute knowledge and power. But in my perfection, I created something that was ultimately sterile, ultimately limited, ultimately a universe without genuine growth because all growth had been determined and constrained within the framework I had established. You, on the other hand, made mistakes. You took risks. You created systems that were not perfect, that had flaws, that had to be continually adjusted and reformed. And because of these imperfections, because of the necessity of constant adjustment and growth, the multiverse has become something extraordinary. What is it that you are asking of me? Synthesis asked, and though his form was vast and cosmic, there was something vulnerable in the question, something that suggested that even after 1,000,000 years, even after all the growth and transcendence, some part of what had once been Goku still desired the approval of those he respected. I am not asking, the Omni King replied. I am observing. I am recording. I am ensuring that the knowledge of what has occurred, the understanding of how growth happens and how it is cultivated, is preserved for the next iteration of existence that will follow this one. You mean that this will end? Celestia asked, appearing beside her father in her individual form. The multiverse will cease to exist. All things that begin must end, the Omni King said. That is the fundamental law of existence. But when this multiverse ends, when its time has reached completion, another will begin, and in that new multiverse, the principles that Goku established, the understanding of growth and elevation and connection that he embodied, will be available to guide those who come next. Quote, in this way, the work never truly ends. The journey of growth and transcendence continues across iterations of existence, each one building upon the achievements of those that came before. Each one reaching toward new heights of beauty and complexity. As the Omni King spoke these words, something shifted in the consciousness of the multiverse. Every being, from the mightiest cosmic power to the humblest individual, felt a kind of completion, a sense that a chapter in the long history of existence was coming to a natural conclusion. And yet, paradoxically, the Omni King had said that the work was not ending, merely transforming, continuing beyond this moment into futures that could not yet be conceived. The Triad Unity stepped forward, and she extended her hand not toward the Omni King, but toward Synthesis, toward the being her eternal partner had become. Then let us make the most of the time that remains, she said. Let us continue to grow, to love, to elevate, to reach toward that which we have not yet become. Not because we are trying to achieve some final perfect state, but because the journey itself, the process of becoming, is what gives existence meaning. And in that moment, in that perfect expression of commitment to the principles that had always guided her, the Triad Unity embodied the truest legacy of Goku's Thusa. ND years of rule. Not the establishment of a perfect system, not the achievement of absolute power, but rather the eternal dedication to growth, to connection, to the belief that all beings could become more than they were. Around her, throughout all 8 universes and the experimental universe beyond, beings felt something shift in their consciousness. They felt the weight of eternity, but they also felt the lightness of hope. They understood that everything they had built, everything they had achieved, everything they had become, was not permanent. But they also understood that impermanence was not a tragedy, but rather a gift. The permission to continue growing, to continue becoming, to continue the eternal journey toward transcendence. And as the multiverse settled into this new understanding, as it prepared for the transformations that would inevitably come, the last traces of Goku's individual consciousness merged completely with the distributed consciousness of Synthesis, and the being who had once been a simple martial artist from Earth achieved at last the only transformation that had eluded him, the transcendence of even the concept of transformation itself. He was, finally, complete. And yet, paradoxically, he had never been less complete, for completion itself was a kind of ending, and Goku, in his truest form, understood that true power lay not in arriving at completion but in the eternal process of incompleteness, in forever reaching toward that which had not yet been attained. The multiverse settled into this new understanding as it prepared for the final transitions that would close the circle of this era. Synthesis, the distributed consciousness of Goku, recognized the presence of the Omni King, who had returned after millions of years to offer a final judgment on the experiment of growth Goku had led. The Omni King admitted that Goku had been right. While his own rule was perfect and sterile, Goku's rule, filled with risks, mistakes, and constant evolution, had created a multiverse that was more complex and genuinely alive. As the Omni King prepared to record these lessons for the next iteration of existence, Goku's individual consciousness underwent its ultimate transformation. The last traces of Goku's individuality merged completely with the fabric of the multiverse itself. He became the silent foundation upon which all future growth would be built. Achieving the transcendence of even the concept of transformation. He was, finally, complete, and yet, as he had learned, true power lay in the eternal process of incompleteness, in F. Or ever reaching toward that which had not yet been attained. The story concludes with the multiverse continuing its journey toward transcendence, no longer ruled by a single throne, but guided by the connection and potential inherent in every living being. Power was never the end of Goku's journey. Strength created silence, victory created choice, and in a universe that once feared destruction, a warrior chose balance. The multiverse didn't bow because it was forced to. It followed because it believed. And somewhere beyond time, the celestial king still watches. Not as a god of fear, but as the guardian of every possible tomorrow. This is What If Nexus, where legends don't end, they evolve.